Hey, welcome everyone. Today we're joined by the amazing Layman Pascal. Thank you so much for joining us today. Layman is well, where to start? I have this introduction for you, Layman, that I wanted to read because I thought it was really cool. It's from the Metapsychosis Journal of Consciousness, Literature, and Art. And it says, Layman Pascal was incarnated on a remote island in the Pacific Northwest. He used to be a meditation teacher, yoga instructor, and public speaker, but he's feeling much better now. I really love that. I feel like that humor and that, there's something about it that really captures what I feel from you in that. There's a real, ease, humor, wisdom, poetry, a philosopher. And I guess to start, I'd really love to hear about your journey with, getting into philosophy, and how that led to meta theories and the kind of integrative spirituality and the practitioner that you are as well.
Well, a lot of threads we could follow there. I was, very drawn to a lot of areas that I would now broadly call shamanic when I was a kid. I was very focused on, nature spirits and alchemists and edge philosophers of various kinds. I got into Nietzsche pretty early as someone who was speaking a philosophical language, but also being a kind of like transformational energy maven of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
Also just really liked intricate logical puzzles, and I liked pressing my mind up to its own limit just as much as I liked doing it with my body as a kid. So I liked to do stunts,
Mm-hmm.
physical stunts when I was a kid, but I also
Cool.
loved trying to wrestle with four-dimensional geometry and things like that because it was the equivalent of some kind of stunt where you go right to your edge.
Wow, it's almost like you're an integral thinker from a super young age, almost.
I think I had a head start in a lot of ways. Like I think we had a pretty progressive but grounded, well-balanced, modern and traditional and hippie kind of household where they
Amazing.
let you, at the very least, talk about anything you wanted to talk about. There were no real limits on what we could intellectually explore, so that was an advantage for me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I followed up a little bit on that stuff. There was some university philosophy, but by and large, my interest after school was primarily around radical existential self-transformation of some kind. So I was in a variety of different spiritual communities, and I was constantly exploring different teachers, tinkering with different meditations, inventing meditations, always trying to map out, what I thought every element of spirituality was. And there would be these periodic moments of success, peak experiences or extended peak experiences. And there was one particular moment where I really didn't feel like I was myself anymore for about a month, and it was just fantastic. And during that month, I lost any real interest in anything other than what I called postmodernism at the time. I was like, because I've been thinking about the postmodern for quite a while. It kind of, you're like, what is it like to just be dragged along the bottom of the Kali Yuga? Kind of, what is the moment of the world that I'm in now? And during this experience, that dropped away. I was interested in what was the next thing. And I felt the space where that next thing would go. And I set out to find who had anything to say about that. And there were not very many people.
Mm-hmm.
One of those people was Ken Wilber, or the extended community of integral thinkers, and they had a language for it. So I made myself learn their language and join their community to see if they would acknowledge me as speaking their language, like a Turing test kind of scenario. And that's all I did there. I dropped out. But about a year later, I was just so on fire with the need to talk to people and have community at that level of integrative abstraction that I went back and I committed to myself to find out if these were my people and just say yes to any proposals they made. And they made a lot of proposals. You want to run sites? You want to give talks? Right? So I just kept saying yes. Pretty soon I'm writing things and devising parts of theory and editing magazines and hosting an integral podcast. But at the same time, It's completely obvious that that branded form of meta theory is not the only one. There are adjacent cousins. There's intellectual resonances in other models. There's emotional resonances. There's a collective world need to do something much bigger than any small group with a particular philosophy can do. So pushing the boundaries of that, and in a way moving away mostly from being in the front part, a philosopher, to being something like a community agent, a diplomat,
Mm.
a cultivator of the scene is where a lot of my work is now, even though in my personal life, it still primarily revolves around spiritual practice. And then also models I built to try to constantly combine all the parts of everything I'm doing.
That's amazing journey. Thank you. Yeah. Oh wow, so many places to dive in, but I'm curious because you're part of the Metamodern Spirituality Practice Labs, and the kind of, and you're in Boulder, Colorado, right? Like so, and there's this existing community of practitioners who sounds like you. It's quite experimental, and does that have that flavor of? Oh, I'm assuming it does actually, but I'm just curious about the flavor of, like, oh, we're doing this not just for our own selfish, enlightenment, but actually for, how does this meet the needs of the world, of our current zeitgeist? And
Well,
yeah,
can I also because I also wanted to know a little bit more about this Metamodern Spirituality Labs. What does that entail, and what's the idea, and yeah,
Sure.
because you touch on it in one of the talks, but I don't really know much about it.
Yeah, so the integral people are centered in a couple of places like Boulder and San Francisco, and there's enclaves in Europe. It's largely an English-speaking movement. The metamodern movement has a little bit more continental European flavor, and we do those labs out of Vermont, although we're expanding to California this year. Uh, Metamodernism has an interesting relationship to integral theory and also to these other networks. It comes initially out of a lot of socio-political and aesthetic and art critique, trying to position itself as postmodern, meaning that it incorporates not only post-modernity's critiques of modernity, but also the things that are interesting about modernity, and also the things that are interesting about traditional and archaic forms of living. So that's also very much what the integral people are trying to do when it comes to the social dimension of their work. But metamodernism is much more diffuse. It's not as branded. It's more open. In a way, the beauty of it is that nobody exactly knows what it means. So anybody can try out whatever they want to try in that space. And it's really inviting to people who don't necessarily have a huge cognitive model of what's going on in the world, but are aware that where we are culturally is something that has to change, and maybe they taste the flavor of what they think that change is. And certainly they're together in front of the large scale, multiple convergent crises that we're facing as a planet, and have a sense that there's some underlying thing that goes wrong in the way we address our collective crises, and we have to fix that in ourselves and in our communities if our strategies are going to have any success. So then you've got this general kind of diverse, nebulous metamodernism that's much more open and permeable than something like integral theory. And how do you bring or promote a kind of spiritual dimension in that work? So what we've been doing, Brendan's hosting and I'm leading these, started off as retreats, then we started calling them labs. We do them about twice a year, so they're a regular part of people's calendar. But the idea is to bring people together who have the liminal or meta-modern temperament, a certain kind of emotional and cognitive style that is pretty fluid, moving back and forth between different worldviews and different value systems, and who can speak one thing and a second later say the exact opposite and mean both of them in a very sincere and coherent fashion. This kind of person. And they tend to be very informed about and concerned about the world situation. They tend to be very resonant with ecological issues. They're very interested in using multiple forms of intelligence in themselves. And this is where it starts to converge with the way that I've developed some versions of Gurdjieffian theory, because these people are experiencing themselves as a plurality and the world as a plurality, and looking at the question of how do we create more integration or coherence between our parts and our systems, than the broader parts and systems in the world, so that we can get like a coherence maximizing civilization of some kind. And then these labs are repeated places for people with that temperament to experiment with practices, create rituals together, and do collective inquiry into facets of traditional religion. So we'll have like a God session where we come for a week and we all examine what's the role of God through a metamodern lens, or what's the role of the goddess, or this spring we're doing what's the role of the subtle domain, right? What does that mean to us in a trans-rational metamodern sense, or whatever?
Yeah.
So we do those deep dives, and then there's a lot of opportunity for shared quasi-religious ritual collaborative innovation, and a lot of opportunity for often me, but also anybody else is there to lead practices and have experimental self-developmental exercise.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool.
Also, I really like that you contrasted integral theory with metamodernism and describing metamodernism as a similar sort of thing, but more open, more what was the word you used? Porous. That's not quite the one, but
Yeah, permeable, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
permeable, exactly. Because actually, Alexandra and I we had a chat last night, you know, kind of preparing, going over, you know, our notes for the talk today. And I actually made a similar comment to him, you know, basically saying that's one of the things that so far, I mean, I'm not that familiar with modernism yet, but and initially I was kind of skeptical. Actually, I was like, is this really necessary? Because I don't know, I am a little bit wary of postmodernism even. So, but certainly, yeah, I think that metamodernism seems to be I don't know, a kind of stepping into the type of thing an integral theory aims to do, but in a way that is self-aware and that includes like an acknowledgement of the limitations of a scheme like that. And there's something really cool and inspiring about that. I think that you know, I really it makes me want to get involved, you know. But I wanted to know, I guess, a little bit more about the history of Layman Pascal in relation to Gurdjieff and metamodernism. Can you trace that? You know, how did you come to be a Gurdjieff student, like specifically, and how did you get involved with metamodernism and the Sky Meadow Institute and all of that?
Sure. Um, So I probably first encountered Gurdjieff in the writing of two guys named Wilson from the 70s. So in the United States, there was Robert Anton Wilson, who I was lucky enough to meet when I was a kid. And then in England, there was Colin Wilson. And they both were presenting his work, admiring his work, but also trying to put their own spin on it. So that's how I initially encountered it. When I got a little bit older, my interest in Nietzsche and the fourth dimension led me to Ouspensky. And I'm like, oh my God, this is great. It's a great conjunction. And it was very much like reading Ken Wilber or something like that. This guy had a huge picture of the world, and it was very well arranged. And it included the need for humans to evolve and change. Fantastic. Then it turned out that guy had a teacher who was much stranger than him. So that excited me. And then it turned out, oh, this is that guy I'd read about when I was younger. So I began to, first of all, read and study all of Ouspensky's books, and then as much of the rest of the Gurdjieff literature as possible, because when you read Ouspensky, that really seems like it's the work. This is the fourth way. And then you read other people who were there, and they're like, yeah, maybe Ouspensky didn't totally get it. You're like, oh, it's more complicated. That's exciting. There's all these different flavors, and then there's these official successors and these other people who get rejected because they're out in the wild. But what happens if we put them together? So I was doing all of that, and increasingly just reading Gurdjieff's books, trying to merge his insights with my own experience, doing practices, always trying to um, read everything from multiple types of lenses through different kinds of experiential modes, always trying to connect them with something I was experiencing, always testing them in practice. And from there, running into a lot of different kinds of Gurdjieff communities. Some of them feeling like they're very official, some of them feeling very unofficial, sometimes just a couple of people experimenting. Very interesting group, people who've left Gurdjieff communities. So there's all these different types all over the world. They have all these different styles. And my sense was that here was a tremendously unique teacher. The people who encountered him were astonished by his understanding and his level of being and his compassion and things like that. But unlike a lot of other teachers who people might say that about, this guy had his own theory of communication. He wrote books that were as strange as Finnegan's Wake. He was writing science fiction before there was basically science fiction. He was a multilingual world traveler, adventurer, and he thought the teaching had to go into the subconscious mind. It was very strange and very much, it seemed to me, just primed to play a role in the contemporary kind of meta-crisis planetary circumstance that we're in. And in some ways, very resonant, even though the Gurdjieffians don't usually talk about it like this, with my own deep interest in shamanism and unfolding a more kind of archaic, organic version of human transformation. So there's the Gurdjieff part. That's all going on with me while I'm in these integral communities for quite a while. And I'm constantly trying to weave these things together. And it seems to me that there's a form of direct integration work that's very visceral that Gurdjieff is talking about, that the integral theory describes, but doesn't really make as much of a direct practice as it could. And then it turns out that if you look at the integral model, you might think, oh, those are the set of things that you would have to integrate. Right? Gurdjieff keeps it kind of simple, and you could say it's very traditional to talk about heart, mind, and body as three intelligent systems that we have. But if you were up in a contemporary way, like Wilbur is or some of these other people, you go, oh, well, maybe there's a dozen different intelligences, and maybe there's different epistemological considerations, and maybe there's this, you start to build out a big mandala, and you go, what if I treated that mandala the same way Gurdjieff treats heart, mind, and body? And what if we built a description of what spirituality is supposed to do based fundamentally on generating surplus coherence out of integrative hybrids of different intelligent systems within the individual, and maybe even looked at a social correlate of that process being something like what religion means, even though it will be described in different ways in different cultures at different time periods. So I'm building like an integrate of Gurdjieffianism over there. And then I get involved with these metamodern people. And I love what they're doing. I'm supporting it as much as I can. I start interviewing and befriending Brennan Graham Dempsey, who's very much interested in both the metamodern and the spiritual and religious dimensions. He decides he wants, there should be some kind of in-person retreats and asks me to lead them. And then in doing that, I realized that a lot of what I'm seeing in the type of person who's coming to metamodern spirituality, or the liminal kind of person, is a readiness for something like a Gurdjieffian approach. Doesn't have to be called that, doesn't have to be a heavy dogmatic thing, but their multiplicity and their need to combine that multiplicity into a coherence, their need for humor, the need for self-exploration, the need for a skeptical mind combined with energy work and things like that. All of that was very Gurdjieffian. And a lot of them had questions for me about Gurdjieff and the teaching as I understood it. So when it came time in our conversations between myself and Brendan and this guy, Jared Morningstar, who's a great metamodern Muslim, he's fantastic. We thought, well, there should be maybe a publishing company here. Maybe we could publish some books that would promote a genre of kind of metamodern spiritual studies. And then the first book we did was Gurdjieff for a Time Between Worlds, which was a title I'd already used on the Integral Stage. And for me, it was going to be, these are the answers to all the questions I get asked in these communities about Gurdjieff, as well as for me, paying something back to him because I feel like I've gained so much, and also a chance for me to put some of my ideas about spiritual communication and out into the world and combine them in a flavor that's rich and multi-perspectival and maybe a little bit funny and unpredictable.
Amazing. Yeah, wow. Okay. I want to pull a thread quickly, because like you said this a couple of times, like noticing the people who are ready, and you mentioned sort of this multiple perspectives or multiple selves that are ready to be integrated in some sense. And in the chat with Brendan, you mentioned this kind of like you mentioned something similar in terms of the archaic mind, or and the psychotechnologies that you're bringing to help with that. And that was also something that Gurdjieff was doing. But then talking about Gurdjieff, and I just want to put this out there now, that the pronunciation, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. I usually just say Gurdjieff, but quickly. But anyway, sorry for bastardizing it.
They're all good as far as I'm concerned, and my bet is he told different people different things about how to pronounce it.
yeah, exactly. But there's something about Gurdjieff that where his teachings, and you've mentioned this before, they do feel Nietzschean, and like Nietzsche said, like, I am dynamite. He's someone who will rock your world, and yeah, there's this real sense of Gurdjieff having a quality of testing, or kind of like an energetic shaking up of the space, and that can feel difficult for a lot of people. Like it's a difficult path of sorts, because it challenges you. And yeah, I'm just curious about, is that kind of your approach too? Because I really sense in you're a very big-hearted person, and there's a kind of, maybe this is just from the limited time I've noticed you, but the softness to you. So I'm curious about that, whether you feel like that harshness or harshness maybe isn't the right word, but yeah, what's your relationship to that kind of quality of the Slayer Man?
There's
the
definitely
rascality.
Yeah, Rascal Pascal. I gave a talk on the figure of the trickster teacher at this thing called Clown Virgins 2 days ago. And there's problems with that figure, right? Just the very idea of that figure almost lends itself to abuse in various ways. I think there's a natural way in which a spirituality that we experience, and not everybody's spiritual path is like this. Somebody's spirituality can be very generic, like you're just a generic human, and here's the generic knowledge, and then you make the generic transformation to the generic consciousness. I don't see Gurdjieff being like that. I see it more organic, right? That the idiosyncratic thing about you is being enabled to flourish, right? That it's a way of training your peculiarity to rise to its highest possible level. And I think where a teaching has a respect for individuality and peculiarity, and where it's, let's say, full spectrum, open on all of its chakras, open on all of its intelligence systems, and in which people who go through this kind of living develop a lot of energy and a lot of nuance, then it's extremely likely that the way they show up will be more tentacled, more complex. It'll fall outside of contexts in a way, not necessarily in a harsh way, like, hey, we've got to break the conventions here, because it's, I think, more natural, more responsive, and maybe it looks a little harder in one circumstance with one group of people and a little softer in another one. But by and large, it seems to me very natural, maybe a little bit elf-like, very benign, the way the grass and the trees and the birds and the lizards would try to teach you. So it's challenging, puts you up against ordeal and complexity. It asks you to participate in your own suffering and your own friction in certain ways, and to follow a growth life that has effort in it, that really is trying to change you and not just trying to accommodate you to the stillness of the background condition of the mind. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in that to be a little bit challenging, and then you have to safeguard yourself against being too challenging, right? So you want to not confine yourself to the expectations and assumptions of the people you're dealing with, but you also want to let your respect for them and for the group consciousness and your love for them as individuals, and your resonance with the space be kind of the guide to what you're doing. And if the people who you like are saying, well, I think you're maybe going a little bit too far now, you're like, okay, on my own, maybe I would do that. Let's blow this all up. But I'm going to dial that back because
Hmm.
there's some real people here I'm trying to talk to, and I'm not going to take all of their sensitivities and anticipations into consideration, but I am
Hmm.
going to try to receive feedback and walk like a fluid middle line between chaos and traditional teaching.
Mm. Yeah, and this is part of our conversation in prep yesterday. Actually, it was around obviously Gurdjieff was a product of his times, and the amount of publicity. He was somewhat of a. I was saying he's equivalent of a public figure in the same way that maybe NSYNC and I are public figures. Like we're barely known, but we're out there in some form. And I imagine Gurdjieff, it was rare perhaps for people to stumble upon him in terms of his his core fraternity or his core kind of temple. So maybe there's a sense of like at that time there was more permission to be a bit more harsh, because it's like, well, I want my people, I want the community here to grow with, but come to my level. Like I want peers. I don't want to like be holding everyone's hand or like trying to. Yeah, I'm curious about if you could speak more to
Well,
Gurdjieff's.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's also a sense in which that serves as a filter, right? Like a kind of a test, a trial by fire. You know what I mean? Like, if you are the kind of person who is cut out to be here, then you will flourish. But if not, then you'll leave. You know, and there's something about that that's very efficient. You know.
Right, and like you're saying, Layman, you don't need to have everyone.
Yeah.
Not everyone's going to be attracted to this path.
There's a lot of issues here, right? On the one hand, there's I think if you're successful to some degree in your existential practice, you're kind of, it's like you're pregnant. There's this thing growing inside you, and as that thing hatches out, you don't exactly know what it's going to do, right? You can have all the values and strategies you want, but it might surprise you. And you might end up just trying to follow it or just trying to hold it back. And so there's this real living, like, if it's a wild horse, what are you going to do? You got to just let that wild horse do what it does. Then there's, like you were saying, there is a filtering aspect to it, right? I find I do that a little bit just with language, especially if you're in public spaces. If you say things that are either very confusing, very complex, or use charged language that people, Nietzsche would do this too, right? Nietzsche used deliberately charged language to make sure the people who were reading him were people who were ready to go past that charge and do the delicate work of separating symbols from reality. And if you're just like, wait, that symbol has a negative charge, well, we don't really want you here, right? It's not that you're bad, but you're not ready for this at the moment. That's not the kind of thing we're working on. I think Gurdjieff also has a particular background, right? And it's not like, in my view of spirituality, you don't become neutral bodhisattvas who all have the same personality characteristics. The neurogenetic and historical person that you are is always the communication tool. And no matter how far you go down the process, that's the language you speak, the language of your structure. His structure was, a patriarchal Greco-Armenian culture in the 19th century, right? So as much as he lived with weird lesbian avant-garde artists in Paris in the 1920s and all this kind of stuff, he still had a huge amount of his formative experience in these really old school patriarchal systems where a bearded guy yells at you to do more, be harder, that kind of stuff. So some of it was just his flavor, and some of it was his need to really put pressure on people who weren't just developing on their own, but developing in a way that he thought was necessary to his general work, right? So some of what he's doing is to try to help other people grow, and some of what he's doing is he thinks he has a project, right? And he really needs certain kinds of helpers, and he needs them soon, and they have to have not just understanding, but a certain kind of rigor, a certain kind of strength. So then beyond all of that stuff, as like a more general principle, you need to be challenged, and your teacher needs to help you suffer in the right way. And that's dependent upon how nuanced he is in seeing where you're at, how nuanced he is in helping you suffer. on how prepared you are to suffer productively rather than badly, and how much he can tell the difference between his inspired attempts to help you suffer and just the normal dickishness of being a human being who wants to meddle in other people's minds sometimes.
Yeah, always hard.
I love that you said that, honestly, because like one of the things actually that is an interesting synchronicity for me, and one of the things that Alexandra and I were discussing is, this notion of like someone who is a bit of a character, who has that kind of challenging way about them. But that you can also feel, first of all, that there's something about them, like this person's been changed by their efforts, and also, this person is trying to help. This person is like this rascality is directed towards helping me to see my own folly, sort of thing, to know myself better, kind of thing. But yeah, there's actually what my ex-mentor who I worked with for a year had a lot of these qualities. And yeah, it's interesting, I think, to think about that recognition of, here's someone who, the way I like to talk about it sometimes is this is someone who's guided. This is someone who is walking a path, and they've walked it a long way, and they have something to teach, you know what I mean? But at the same time, this is just a human being, you know what I mean? And there is sometimes, even for that person, there is a blurring of the lines between I'm trying to help and fuck you, you little shit. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the integral theory does a good job of modeling a lot of this, of saying like, okay, there's multiple intelligences and you can be really good at these ones and not so good at these ones. And then you have to do shadow work in addition to that. So you can lay out a map that would be a really good framing device for people. But in practice, it seems to be a lot simpler than that, which is you just have to be aware that as good as you are at anything and as inspired as you are, you can't always tell the difference between where you leave off and some function begins. So I don't know if you know Andrew Cohen, the famous spiritual teacher, died in the last couple of weeks. I've been doing some interviews with his students. He was very popular, ran a big magazine, had a big community in the 90s, and then there was a collapse of his community, and then a period of his wandering in the wilderness, and then he had a new community in India, and now he's passed on. But one of the things he told me was this sort of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 approach when he looked back, because he was known as being a very, very tough teacher who put a lot of pressure on people to transcend themselves. And he thought about 1/3 of the time that he was completely inspired in those moments. And it was a direct hit, and he was able to help his students do something that it would have taken them a very long time, if at all, for them to achieve in themselves. And then about another 1/3 of the time, he was inspired, basically correct, but maybe didn't get it quite right, and maybe helped them a little, maybe it was neutral, maybe destabilized them a bit. And then another 1/3 of the time, it was his own human impulses, just aggression and control and wanting to be right and wanting to be the teacher and thinking he knew better than you. And he couldn't tell that apart from those other two, right? And so that was his sense at the end of a long life of being an internationally prominent character doing this kind of thing. So to me, that's very illuminating. Right, that's necessarily going to be the case in some way, no matter how much you've sacrificed your unit to a transcendental flow or a greater beingness or something. The unit's always going to have its tendencies. No one is ever humanly perfectly developed, and they have to at least be aware of that and be able to talk to the people around them about that. Because it's okay for it to be messy, and it's okay for you to make mistakes. And there will be turbulence. And if you're going to co-enact a spiritual thing with somebody, yeah, it can go wrong. It can not work. It can be a mess. It can cause chaos. All that stuff has to be understood. But you at least need a frame of epistemic humility where you say, yeah, I could be wrong. And well, let's talk about it.
Yeah, I love that. It feels like such a big journey that I've been on as well, of like trying to pull apart, like, when is it true intuition and when is it just my mind running away, or when is it just kind of like a habit or an impulse or whatever it is. And I love that framing of like, I probably will never get it 100%, right? Like there's never, and that probably is not even the goal. Like I want to get better at it. But yeah, I really like that. It's like remind myself that it's okay that I don't know, like most of the time probably. But still not to let that stop me from trying, right? Like I think that's the important part.
Yeah, that's the so metamodernism has this famous aesthetic of sincere irony, right? So the irony is a way of talking about modern and postmodern critical distance, of sort of being suspicious of everything. That the modernists were like, oh, all that nonsense everybody's been believing is just pre-rational group nonsense. And then the postmodernists were like, yes, and your modern shit is pre-rational nonsense as well, because where did you get your ideas of science and reason and progress, and what does the GDP actually mean, and are we even individuals, and all this kind of like super critical deconstruction of the basic structures of sense making, which allow you to be standoffish and jokey and critical. But what you get in a lot of postmodernism is a spiritual barrenness, right? You become a kind of a nullity. You just exist as your identity, and other people have to appreciate your identity, and you're never really involved in the world because you can't trust everything you've deconstructed. But the metamodern idea is, no, if you keep going, if you keep deconstructing and deconstruct even your deconstruction, then you return to a kind of sincere participation, a full emotional and physiological and social and virtue-oriented engagement in the world, but you don't lose any of that skepticism, criticism, irony, all that kind of thing. So you've got both of those. And to bring those together and to say, well, we don't really know, and in some ways we can't really know. We're never going to find information and knowledge about the world that's outside of our interpretive frames, right? It's not an old-fashioned thing where we go, yes, those are your beliefs, but there's really this thing. You go, well, that's kind of interpreted as well. You're like, okay, that's the situation. We're going to take that situation seriously. Everything is intercontextual. That doesn't mean we hold back, right? That's even the reason for full dynamic, transformational human engagement with the world as it comes at us. And bringing those two together is, I think, at the core of the metamodern ethic and especially of metamodern spirituality.
Yeah, really lovely. And definitely it seems like almost like a revival in a way of a kind of existentialist strain of thought that has been around for quite a long time. I wanted to, in that vein, I wanted to circle back around a little bit to Colin Wilson. He actually has a great book. I would call it an existentialist book called The Outsider. But I was curious, what texts did you read that by him that introduced you to Gurdjieff? And I mean, because interestingly, one of the strange parts of this synchronicity, this strange parallel between this conversation around Gurdjieff and my ex-mentor Mystic is I actually came into contact with Gurdjieff through Colin Wilson because Mystic recommended to me that I read Mysteries, which is the middle book of the Occult trilogy. And obviously Gurdjieff is one of the things that Colin Wilson talks about quite a bit in that trilogy. But I'm curious, what was your introduction to Colin Wilson's work?
Yeah, Colin Wilson, and there's a few people around who were really affected by Colin's work, and I think it's hard to get a good public appreciation of him because he wrote in so many genres that it's hard for normal thinking to take him seriously. But I think he's a really profound thinker, and probably the first Western philosopher to try to think about how you actively produce peak experiences and what that would change for us as a species. The Occult and Beyond the Occult were probably the first two I read. Circled back to The Outsider. Read those novels about the giant spiders. His book about the history of crime and murder, right? And that's very interesting because you get this dark shadow side of peak experiences. Some of his novels, his like Lovecraftian novels, the names are like The Philosopher's Stone doesn't sound Lovecraftian, but the ancient entities that people see once their new faculties are enacted in themselves, that stuff was fascinating for me. And I've got a great audiobook compendium of him, because this book came out a couple of years ago that just has samples of him from all throughout his work with a couple of new forewords. Beautiful audiobook collection. I
Wow,
sample it a lot.
I would love it if you could link me to that or something, because
Yeah,
that's
I
I'm
will
definitely
make a
interested.
note.
Yeah. I'm curious as
Well,
well.
let me say a few more things about him, because he is really, I mean, first of all, he's a great writer for a young man, because it's about focus, and it's about sex, and it's about transgression, and it's about being like a special group of male social outsiders who are the secret higher people. So like that's all very attractive in an adolescent sense. But the thing I love most about him is his relentless fixation on how you use intentional attention to provoke changes in your energy state and consciousness, and that he will do that in any genre of book, right? If the publisher says, hey, people need an opera, he's got, great, here's my opera. People use intentional focus to induce peak experiences. Like, all right, a book about serial killers, great. Here's how serial killers use intentional focus to induce peak experiences. So he's relentless in putting this one message forward in a very open-ended way, saying, let's really explore the phenomenological mechanisms, and he's willing to do it in any style you put before him. I just find that delightful.
Yeah, he's a brilliant writer. I'm curious if you know. Actually, I'd love to hear your opinion on it. But actually, he published a more recent book called "The War Against Sleep." It's like a revisiting of all of his work on Gurdjieff. Um, I'm curious, if you've read that, what you think of it, if you have, and I guess also, like, maybe to just get us back into Gurdjieff a little bit, like, how would you relate to that framing of Gurdjieff as being about the robot and sleep? And because Colin Wilson is very heavy on that, which I understand he gets a lot from Ouspensky, but I really love that framing, and that framing's been very resonant for me. And I heard you talking a little bit in a couple of your videos about. I mean, you seem very conscious of the influence of translation and the role that interpretation plays in explaining someone else's ideas, and the role of your own ideas getting involved in that and getting mixed up. And yeah, so I guess I'm just trying to probe a little bit into that
Sure.
nexus.
Yeah, I mean, Colin Wilson is not generally well respected among Gurdjieffians. And I think that's two things. First of all, there's a ton of stuff he leaves out. Second of all, he's trying to make it his own, right? He really brings his own ideas into it. And that's what I respect about his work, right? The robot and the Laurel and Hardy theory of consciousness, and how efforts can break frames and cause you to use more energy. And the more energy you send to your consciousness, the more it gets psyched about that, and you get a little productive feedback loop going. I think that's a fantastic element of what Gurdjieff was saying. I think Wilson's framing is very often overly influenced by Ouspensky's, as so many of the framings are. And it's completely understandable why. And it's not problematic as long as we know about it, right? Lots of traditions are, especially traditions that call themselves the fourth way, are pretty well set up by the Ouspenskyan frame, such that even when they encounter Gurdjieff's own writing, they're always trying to figure out how it fits into what Ouspensky was saying. And that's not bad. Ouspensky is brilliant. But there are more tentacles than that, and a much more interesting mess, all centered around Gurdjieff's own deliberately strange thicket of writings. And then everybody's different interpretive takes. And then when you get involved, you're obviously going to have your own interpretive take. And you do your work to keep growing past that and challenging it. But it's also the very thing that's going to steer you through this, because as far as I read Gurdjieff, he's asking you to develop something unique about yourself, right? And when he puts out Beelzebub's Tales, yes, it's a great critique of the life of man, and yes, it's communicated to the subconscious, and yes, it has all the pieces of his teachings scattered through that in a very interesting way, but it's also a weird imaginal universe. It's a tremendous science fiction landscape, And it's not like you're supposed to take on board this idea that super intelligent ravens live on Mars and are studying the fundamental nature of a transpolar life energy that governs the cosmos, right? But what I think he's asking you to do is develop your own nonsense to that level of sophistication.
Wow, I love that so much. Yeah, I'm trying to write a novel that embodies a lot of my thinking, and it's a challenge. But the freedom there in what you described is kind of the not like bringing more nonsense to it, like making it too serious. Like I love satire, and I love bringing humor to this kind of work. But yeah, bringing something the sci-fi genre, and especially gives a lot of permission for that. Gonna have to think about that.
It's a balance, right? You have to constantly task yourself to be more disciplined, be more robust, not just be playing with ideas, but at the same time, you have to feel completely free to play with ideas.
It almost feels like the practice, right? Like we talk about the work of helping heal the robot or whatever, coming out of sleep. It feels like we need the sort of I don't know, there's a seriousness to it and a play to it, right? Like we need the play is sort of the balm, and the seriousness is the kind of a focus, and yeah, there's something really important about that.
Well, another thing I think, and I think play is a really important word for this reason, but play is one of those very primitive notions that is a nexus of meanings. And so one of the senses of play is latitude, right? Is the capacity to innovate, to be organic, to be spontaneous. That's one sense of play, which I really love, because that's a big part, I think, of the importance of play in, I think, being serious about the world, is the willingness to come up with something totally audacious and then go, hold on a minute, but what if though? Like, let's imagine what the world would look like if we took this to be true. Like, what would that be, and how could that maybe help us to live, and what possibilities might that unlock for us if we imagined that this was true?
Yeah, that brings up two things for me. One is the role of child practice, right? So there's an emphasis in Gurdjieff, more so than in a lot of contemporary spiritual teachings, about how do you mature as an actual human being, right? Or it's not like, well, should I be a Buddhist or a Muslim? Like, can you be a Buddhist or a Muslim? Like, are you even a person yet? Like, let's get you some basic functional human capacities first. So there's this real focus on adulting in Gurdjieff, but there's also a thing about children where they are the fastest developers we know, right? They go through huge stages of maturation at a rate far in excess of the adults. And partly because it's built in, and partly because society backs them up on that. But one of the things we don't really inspect very often is, what are they doing as exercises? Are they doing some form of the work, right? And you see them experimenting with negative sensations. They might touch that hot thing. They might eat that sour candy. They might smell that disgusting thing. They're also involved in some form of making up arbitrary rules for themselves that they have to carry out tasks around, right? Like, oh, we can't step on the cracks on the pavement. You're like, okay, that's an unnecessary intention-driven consciousness practice. And maybe a lot of what we're calling play is actually a reasonably simplified natural version of intentional suffering and conscious labor in the Gurdjieffian sense. So it's worth looking at the more playful elements of it. The other thing that I would bring in, and I always think it's really pertinent that Gurdjieff is living in Paris in the 1920s, because I grew up, I didn't mention this earlier, but I was deeply into the surrealist art movement as a philosophy. I was reading the manifestos in high school and trying to do the kinds of practices they were doing, because I really believed, in kind of a shamanic instinctual way, that there was another form of awareness you got by merging consciousness and unconsciousness. Right, that there was some like hybrid version of the subconscious that you could bring forward by merging what we might now call the two hemispheres of the brain or something like that. And you need a tremendous amount of imaginative play to merge with your reasonable understanding and perceptions in order to catalyze a kind of supermind of some kind. And Gurdjieff talks very explicitly about how what we call the subconscious is what he calls the real conscious mind. And then he gives us a fantastic, an imaginal universe worthy of a Salvador Dali painting, right? There's a real imaginative freedom and play in what he puts forward there. So I think of the child aspect and the surrealism aspect as essential to the role of play in something like the work.
So just had like a moment there, just like kind of absorbing all of this, because it feels like really resonant for a lot of what I'm working on at the moment.
Definitely, yeah. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the title of your book, right? So there's in some sense two titles. One of them is Gurdjieff for a Time Between Worlds. Is that it? Right? Is that the right? Have I got it right? Like, could you maybe unpack what that means? And also, I have more of a sense of this second thing, but I'm thinking it could be helpful for the audience for you to explain the meaning of this notion of hyper-personal essays.
Okay. Hyper-personal essays, and I'm trying to do three things. I'm like, this is about Gurdjieff, but it's also about where Gurdjieff intersects with and is needed by these new culture and thought communities that are epitomized but not limited to metamodernism. And there's no way for me to do that except in a way that dredges up my unique experiential wisdom, my subconscious. I'm trying to meet him. I'm trying to meet the teaching in that
we're
form.
talking to you for a reason, so.
Yeah. And so I also think there's another element to hyperpersonal, which I mentioned earlier, in the difference between an idiosyncratic and a generic spiritual teaching. Right? If we say, look, there's some problem or limitation in the normal experience of being a person, particularly a person in this society or moment of history, it's insufficient somehow. What's the solution? Is the solution a training that moves you beyond the problematic personal to an impersonal domain, where you now no longer have desire, you no longer have drive, you no longer have peculiarity, you're increasingly abstract and impersonal? There have been a lot of spiritual teachings of that kind. They're fascinating, but I don't think that's what Gurdjieff is talking about. I think he's talking about another way of going beyond the merely personal into a kind of deeper or richer or more fantastic version of the personal. So I call that hyper-personal. And I think we have to really embrace our own peculiarity in order to start to find our navigational direction toward that thing. There are certain elements of the world that need to be embraced, I think, in spirituality. And Gurdjieff was very earthy, very funny, right? He wasn't an ascetic who was moving away from the earth or trying to escape from mortality or anything like that. He really embraced everything. And I think one of the things you have to embrace in the world is the strangeness and the individuality of human beings, right? He talked a lot about essence and personality. And you can meet people who have a lot of personality and they're very individual and they just have no essence. On the other hand, you can meet people who have tremendous essence, right? Maybe they're a guy on the street who can't even speak to you. He sounds like a lunatic, but you just feel something in his being. But there's no person there. There's no really unique individual. There's no way for him to articulate anything. So there's a possibility of bringing your deeper, organic, essential peculiarity together with your ability to formulate and enact yourself as an individual in a society to create something that's a supra-individual, a hyper-individual of some kind, and that there's a flowering there that can have many stages to it. And that's largely how I would frame something like Gurdjieff's teaching. Now, the main part of the title, Gurdjieff for a Time Between Worlds. Time Between Worlds is a phrase that was popularized by the developmental theorist Zach Stein. He was in the integral movement for a while. He's a big Colin Wilson fan too, by the way. He's an educational theorist, and he's characterized the time that we're in as basically one big general paradigm of sense-making, about how to organize society, how to educate people, what we are as beings, that existed for many years, created a whole new modern society, a whole transformation of the world. Now it's floundering, now it's insufficient, and we don't have the new one yet. So the way he uses that phrase is we're between two, like, general paradigms, two general sense-making regimes. We haven't installed the new one. The old one's failing. It's a really weird, transitional, chaotic time. My take is a little bit different because I come at it from more of this shamanic angle has a real affinity for the weird, for the strange, for the haunting, evocative echoes of the world, let's say. And my sense is that the time between worlds may be the characteristic of the new world, right? It's not like we've just gone off course and we're going to quickly get back on course and implement the new operating system. I think the trajectory you see is that things are pretty weird and they're going to get weirder, right? That this is, it's either a very long in-between, interregnum between the two worlds, or the new world itself has the flavor of being between worlds. So we're in the between worldsness now, and we might be in this period for quite a while. So how do we bring our spiritual mentors, our exemplars, our wisdom teachings, our best theories and practices around human maturation and the cultivation of civilization with us into this weird, strange, new, unpredictable world of absurdity that's unfolding before our eyes from day to day, right? How do we become indigenous to the peculiar? And can Gurdjieff come with us? I think he can. There may be that there's some other kinds of teachings that are going to have a much harder time coming with us and helping us in this new phase. But I think his is very robust and uniquely well suited to take root in the time between worlds.
I love that framing. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of, I can never remember his name. There's a book called A Sense of the Cosmos. His first name is Jacob. The second name is like Needham or Needlem or something. But he describes it very similarly, but he describes it as a time between dreams, actually, which I really like. And what I really liked about your description was that, you offered up as a possibility this notion that maybe the new world just has this flavor of being between worlds. I think it is something like that. I think this new dream has a quality of being, there's a lucid dreaming aspect to it where, there's some sense of the opening up of the possibilities of reality, I think, in the next 50 to 100 years, where you're right, things are going to get weirder and weirder. I do think there is, in some senses, unimaginable order that will emerge out of that. But certainly, the sense of like a time between worlds, well, the previous world is so radically different from whatever the new world is going to be that it's arguable that it's not even appropriate to call them both the same type of thing,
Yeah. There's I think there's both a weirdness that's going to accrue because of new tools and mutations and transformations and all the unexpected juxtapositions that are going to happen going forward, right? We're changing the planet. We've got plastic in our blood. We can change our genders. We're growing ears on fish. Dire wolves are back apparently this week. Right. So TV stars are presidents. And one day we'll look back and go, remember when Donald Trump was president in the United States? What a simpler, more sensible time that was than whatever's going to happen next. Right. Where there's an accumulating manifest strangeness, but there's also a sense in which there's a new sensibility, and we see that sensibility in the leading edge of our physics, right? In relativity and quantum mechanics. We see it in our philosophy and people who are like, what meaning changes in a parallaxical fashion whenever I move, right? There's a tremendous relational amplification of the peculiar in-between conditions, and you find it in all kinds of disciplines. And I think it's slowly going to become the norm for the new phase. And I think a teaching that explicitly looks at you not as an overt rational individual, but as a combination of different parts that are interacting with each other, in which your spiritual life consists of trying to mediate between your different drives and parts and values in order to get a better teamwork, which means a better in-betweenness. I think that's what Gurdjieff offers, and that's why it's really appropriate to what might be a long-running universe of in-betweenness.
There's a bunch of really great psychotherapy practices like Gestalt and parts work and internal family systems, and they all sort of approach this the psyche as a dynamic interplay of parts. And uh, it doesn't feel like a new idea, though, right? Like in mythology, there's always multiple different, especially the more pagan ones, different entities, and they're all kind of vying for power, and almost like they've captured, like it's been captured throughout history, this sort of unconscious interplay of parts. And we've known, like, even the pantheon of gods, and it just feels very not almost like not a new thing, but we're learning to turn towards it in some way, and work with it in a different way, like rather than just building a temple and praying to Ares or whatever for power. There's some integration, right? Like there's the shadow work is about that thing is not outside of me anymore. It's here. What gifts does it have for me? What's the virtues and the vices? Or like, where is it dangerous? Where is it coming out sideways? Yeah, it feels exciting. It feels like, especially with the more modern, I guess, attempting to be a bit more empirically verifiable psychotherapeutic tools, this work feels like it's taking on a brand new lens of sorts, right? Like if we can integrate the work in a kind of more occult, esoteric sense and utilize these tools of self-inquiry and space holding, like one of the most foundational qualities of psychotherapy, I think, is like being able to hold space for a whole host of different energies and qualities and voices and whatnot. And there's definitely something in terms of psychoeducation that I always try and provide. I think it's like the most foundational thing of sorts, like just that's there. I don't have to be in it, but I can see it. I can sit next to it like an old friend. I can talk to it and check it out. And then I can kind of like, what's it like to actually get a bit closer? And yeah, I'm curious to hear actually from you, Layman, a bit more about your integration of modern technologies within Gurdjieff's framework.
Yeah, there's a really interesting kind of a pattern. Kay Wilmer has this phrase that became really popular, the pre-trans fallacy. So like trans-rational and pre-rational are often confused because they're both not the same as rational, or trans-conventional and pre-conventional, that kind of thing. But there is a sense in which something ancient exists, and then there's some new form that's powerful but simplified, and it seems to deviate, but if it's followed far enough, it returns and offers a new articulation of the ancient thing in a slightly different register and with new tools at its disposal. And it's very similar to the notion of having an essence and then having a social personality, and then trying to get your social personality to reincorporate and bring forth your essence into some kind of hybrid. We were talking about the potential strangeness of the new epoch. Well, is it any stranger than in the jungle, where you go out there and everything is buzzing and twisting and growing through itself, and creatures are disguised as other creatures, and right? That's really the nature of the biosphere out of which we emerge. It's hyper peculiar, but we didn't necessarily have the technological or left brain rational sophistication to meet that. And as we started to develop that over the course of the last few thousand years, it really seemed like we were succeeding and deviating. But now we've come into this time where it almost looks like the reverse is happening, right? If you sat down in front of 19th century science, you would say, this is mechanistic, reductionistic, Cartesian, Newtonian nonsense. It'll never fully grasp love and development and God and spirit and nature. But a couple of decades later, when we're seeing fractals emerge out of computers, we go, oh, we might have been wrong about that. It might be that the whole, what Heidegger called the logic of techne, right? The technological attunement to the world, actually, if you let it run its course, returns to, re-embraces and catalyzes the ecological realm in a really interesting new way. So I don't know if we have a lot of time for me to go into my elaborate theories about the relationship of the noosphere and the biosphere.
We have as much time as you have.
All right. I mean, I have this sense, And I think it's important to consider Gurdjieff as a contemporary representative of archaic wisdom, because he framed it that way himself, that he was looking for how humans play their appropriate role in the biosphere. And the place he was looking was upstream of the diverse esoteric traditions that we inherit from some prior condition, whether we imagine that as Atlantis or ancient secret societies, or however we imaginally construct that for ourselves. The idea is there's some pre-civilized form of wisdom development that all of the great wisdom traditions are descended from, right? And that's a shamanic wisdom in its flavor, because it takes place in the tribal and the ecological circumstance of the human being. So he's looking there, and we're also coming out of a phase. And when you come out of a phase, it's important to look back at the beginning of that phase. So I'm super interested in his work as an attempt to use both classical, spiritual, and contemporary technological forms of thinking to articulate a return to the basic operational principles that might have held sway in archaic human development circumstances. And I think that is uniquely appropriate to a time in history where we have to become more intentional and technological about the way that we participate in what nature has been trying to do through us. And that the biosphere and the technosphere can be considered to be something that that Gaia, let's say, that the biosphere is using to modify itself. And it modifies itself in two directions. It anchors itself, and it also changes itself, right? So there's phases of this process, and as we go forward, we have a possibility of anchoring and expanding in a new way. Expanding might mean it looks different, it changes. Biology is different on this planet. It goes into colonies, it goes to Mars, it goes into whatever multiplicity of dimensions the rest of the universe turns out to consist of. So there's this double move, and this double move is served by human beings both in an external and an internal capacity, right? So there are shamanic and artistic and poetic and intersubjective elements that we want to get better at. And there's technological, social, architectural elements that we want to get better at. And so where are we in this process? We're at an interesting moment where we need to get much more practical about how we retro-engineer the functional principles of all previous spiritualities so that we can implement them as part of our lived spiritual inhabiting of the biosphere. And we have to produce technologies that allow the biosphere to super integrate itself and mutate. And then one argument is that's sort of what AI is. Like, what does AI look like? It's all very speculative, but what does AI look like if it's something that the biosphere wants and that the biosphere is creating through us? The guy that coined the term Gaia hypothesis has been thinking this way for a while.
It's funny because it's almost as if there's a way in which it just naturally converges back to the through line, say, that you can kind of imagine, just extend the trend to AI. AI is the kind of thing that could exert planetary control over how we use resources or something like that, and stop humanity pillaging the planet and, you know, this runaway train that we're on, which no human being seems capable of getting under control.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be careful. We can't just assume it's going to magically fix things. But if we do the thought experiment like Gurdjieff does of imagining an expanded cosmos of many worlds, what does it look like in all the other biospheres, right? Do they all sort of reach a point where something like an AI emerges and something like a distributed real-time feed of the information from the social and the ecological dimension is made available and distributed back through the system so that it can super coordinate, and then it flowers, blossoms, does some strange thing that's its next maturational step? Two other things pop up for me around that. One is and I talk about this in the book, Gurdjieff tries to frame psychotechnologies, right, human inner practices, as service to the biosphere, which is a very contemporary shamanic kind of a move as far as I'm concerned. But when you read through the mythology of Beelzebub's tales, you get stories about how something's happened anciently involving the life world, and it needs certain kinds of energies from us. And so we've evolved in this need, and we can produce these energies either in a really low-grade way, just by living and dying, in which case there'd need to be many, many, many of us who constantly died, or we could produce them in a more elegant, more sophisticated, high quantity, high quality fashion by doing certain kinds of exercises. And the side effect of that work would be that we would develop our own souls, but the real function would be to serve some kind of self-organizational process
Sure.
of the Earth and the Moon and the solar system. Now, whatever we make of that, it is at the very least an attempt to start framing the necessity for intentional inner practice as a function of the ecological system that
Yeah.
we're in. And it's
I mean,
unlikely that we're going to resolve our ecological problems unless we think of our inner attempts as being part of its spectrum of needs, let's say.
yeah. Well, I mean, just something I'm really loving about this conversation right now is I've been familiar for a while with the kind of picture that Gurdjieff paints of the cosmology, which is so radically different from, say, my scientifically inherited perception that I almost just like, I don't, it's just, let's just put it over there. You know, I don't know what to make of that. But interestingly, listening to you, you've just given me a window into that of why he would compose a narrative like that. And it makes a lot of sense now that I can have this, now that I can get a sense of what he might be aiming at in projecting a narrative like that. Super interesting. I also, though, just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge something I'm really appreciating about speaking with you that I've noticed in the videos, but I'm noticing even more now, which is you're extraordinarily articulate, and it's very easy to. I think you have a real gift for making the ideas accessible, which makes it it's a wonderful experience to do a jazz session with you, because part of the point of the jazz session is for us to try and harmonize, to try and create a window for the audience. But it's almost like we don't even need to do it. We can just sit back and enjoy the conversation because you're doing all that work. You're already translating it so well and expressing yourself so clearly. I just wanted to acknowledge that. Yeah, I really admire that quality in people. So
Yeah, you're there. You're in the work. And again, the translation of Gaia through you is amazing.
I appreciate that. Thanks, guys.
And yeah, it's just, I feel like there's the practice of doing the work and framing it in terms of coordinating, cooperating with a kind of higher force that is not just, I mean, we could look at it in a kind of solar system way or a universal way, but there's these layers. Obviously, it's a fractal layered system. So think about it in a community sense, or like even in this group, or just the three of us now, there's a third thing that is manifesting that we can tap into and help support each other, or that if it's a bigger group or if a culture and the world itself has, the noosphere is maybe the kind of new world of the time between worlds is sort of the dreaming of the world of the noosphere of Gaia kind of becoming lucid and sort of being like, hey, I'm in the dream still, but something like that feels like possibly.
There's when we try to figure out, as I often do, and so do a few other people, what's characteristic of this new spirit. One of the things is that you can move coherently between different kinds of frameworks. One is that you can be very humorous and critical and contextually aware without losing participation. But another one is a real emphasis on intersubjectivity, right? And on shared fields, on collective intelligence, collective sapience, things like that. It seems like the people who are coming into metamodernism, coming into liminal communities, coming into even the more kind of technical approaches, integral, game B, all that kind of stuff, there's a tremendous sense of both needing and instinctively feeling that it's possible to presence something that's shared between us. Now, there's uh, predecessors of that, but they seem like they're too specific, right? If you read the Gospels, then you go, well, where two or three of you are gathered in my name, there I am, says the Spirit. You're like, great, okay, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. But it's more than a specific historical or mythological instantiation of that. It's a much broader, richer, constantly experimental, fractally distributed thing where we all have to get a lot better at um, the spiritual and practical and cognitive and emotional skills necessary to be part of something together, even if we have our own styles and specialities.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I know obviously it's important to Gurdjieff this notion of an upstream source, and it seems actually from some of the things you've said that you quite like this idea as well, like a proto lineage or something like that. As it happens, my ex-mentor Mystic, he was obsessed with this idea, and he made some concrete attempts to try and map out what he thought the historical transformation of ideas was. But I'm curious, do you have a sense yourself, like a specific sense of what that might be? Or yeah, do you have a picture, like a historical a historical
I
trace that
have
you would
I have a
articulate?
favorite fantasy.
Okay, yeah, I'd love to hear it.
And they're all subject to change because we're constantly discovering new things about the past. It's one of the weird things about the current time is like we know more about ancient Egypt today than we did 10 years ago. Right? So there are many things about the past that are their information pattern is increasing as we go forward in a certain weird way. There's a lot of people starting to really do fascinating research on the really strange megalithic kinds of constructions, right? We're getting much more granular in our sense of, oh, the Incas built this, but somebody else built these ones, and they were not built in the same way at all. So there was some kind of ancient technical wisdom that we're pretty sure of. There may or may not have been a great catastrophe. My sense is that there's a long simmering development of human wisdom that came in dreams and trances and work with psychedelics and out of practical tasks, out of sex and out of hunting and out of being with the land and out of the heartbreak of relationships and child raising. There was this slow accumulation of wisdom for a long time. And it led to the um, conservation, socially and evolutionarily, of the kind of person that we might now look back on and call a shaman, some kind of subset of the tribe that was an esoteric specialist. That this was more or less common, and they slowly accumulated for hundreds of thousands of years, this capacity, and then the ice ages came. And there was this intense inward focus of really trying to wrestle with and struggle under these difficult conditions. And then eventually there was a thaw, right? And so now we're looking at the last 20 or 30,000 years. And as this thaw comes, these groups suddenly re-expand into the world. Everything's a lot nicer and they can go where they didn't used to go. And immediately they start running into each other. And the differences between two countries today is probably nothing compared to the way two different tribes or clans felt about each other. Just an absolutely, similar to us, but alien, foreign, weird, devil worshiping madness over there, right? So the intermediation between the tribes came from these peculiar people who already felt like outsiders inside their own tribe, right? Who felt like aliens no matter how much they fit in. And they were good diplomats in some way. They were diplomats between the physical and the imaginal, between the human and the ecological, and between the tribes. So these people, probably high in what we would call trait openness today, they interacted with each other to form the links between these tribes. And as the tribes grew, these people got together with each other and saw the slightly different ways and different degrees of success with which they were going about their practices. And they often realized they had more in common with each other than they had in common with their own tribes. So while still trying to serve their tribes, you begin to get something like brotherhoods, sisterhoods, esoteric networks operating between or around the tribes as the tribes build up. And they're sharing their knowledge, and they develop something like a pedagogical skill. They become good at educating people. They're cultivationist in their attitude. So people who have good, mature, networked shamanoids of various kinds in their tribes, your tribe's probably going to be a little bit smarter, a little bit faster. It's going to have a little bit better tools. It's going to be better at organizing, going into group trance states, accomplishing things, navigating, interpreting dreams, taking the psychedelics, using the ordeals properly. And these people are also meeting with themselves to see if they can get better and better at this. And I think for a while, somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 years ago, some of them get really good at this. And there's a kind of birth of the spirit of feeling civilized, right? And not all the people, all the humans and the Denisovans and the Neanderthals and everybody else, they weren't all in on this, but some of them were, and it was flourishing, and they knew how to make the soil more fertile. They knew how to navigate. They knew how to build. They could make tremendously arcane structures, and they knew how, most importantly, to breed and educate the kinds of people who could do that, right? It's one thing to go, how did they build this? But really, like, how did they make anybody who could even come up with building it know how to do it and implement it? That's the more interesting question. Some of them had this educational process. And I think our wisdom traditions descend from that educational process in various ways, and that for probably numerous reasons, there was a breakdown in this system, right? There may have been some kind of ecological upheaval, but you don't even need that. All you need is cities to begin, right? Settlements. Then you have these people running into problems around civilization. There's kings. There's the formalization of their role into
more complex
priesthoods.
power dynamics, right?
Yeah, it all shifts. It all gets disrupted. New wars emerge, and you can lose and regain things many times over thousands of years. So there's this civilization thing starts, and you lose a lot of this.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of what we might call Atlantis or whatever is a way of thinking about an actual period of time where there was really high grade wisdom development as part of human tribal life and as part of an educational intergenerational transfer, at least in some tribes in some parts of the world, and that people that were good at this stood out as kind of superhuman to the people around them, such that if they went somewhere and started to help a new tribe flourish, they might remember that person as, oh, one of the magic people came from the other place and showed us about farming and helped us fish better and made this calendar for us, right? That kind of stuff. So to me, I try to fit these stories into a more or less updated contemporary version of history.
No, I love it. I mean, that's a remarkably sophisticated and sober piece of storytelling, you know, especially in its recognition of, well, this is my little fantasy, but for being a little fantastical reconstruction of history, I like it. I'll buy it. You know what I mean? That sounds, honestly, it sounds very similar to what I already had a vague notion of something similar in my own head. So, and I guess I'm curious to know to what degree that for you is connected with synchronicity, because at least this was Mystics. That's my teacher. His thought, he was obsessed with synchronicity, and he thought that synchronistic insight was tied up with or at the root of religious and spiritual experiences, and therefore he thought that, like, going way back through history in a similar way, but specifically focused on synchronicity, that there was this set of people who he basically thought synchronicity is a human reality, which is a concept that Jung also believed. And that, you know, when there's something like that, a human reality, some people get really good at it. You know, if there's a way, if there's a will, there's a way. And you know, yeah, so some people get really good at it, and then they kind of practice this thing. He called it stalking synchronicity, trying to make synchronicity happen, trying to induce these peak experiences or flow states. And I wanted to bring this up earlier because for me, this is one of the things I learned early on working with him was the intentional effort, the intentional energy is key and amplifies synchronicity significantly. You know, if you invest your attention, it amplifies the phenomenon, which is an extraordinary thing. You know, usually I think rational-minded people think, no, that cannot be. That's going to be some kind of, illusion or something like that. But no, really, that is how it works. So yeah, I'm just curious how much that connects up for you and what you make of synchronicity.
Yeah, it's an interesting word because in some ways it smacks a little bit too much of late 20th century Western boomer mysticism in some ways, but I think there's also a deep reality to it. Time is worthy of its own dozen podcast interviews. But the coordination, right? I think the principle of synergy, let's say, is at the heart of so much of this stuff. We're trying to create a greater sync between different kinds of intelligence systems within ourselves. And the result of that synchronization is a general sense of coordination that feels magical, and we might call it our being or something like that. And I think that helps us navigate through richer and richer layers of integrated experience in the world. And those layers are fascinating because in some ways they're there from the very beginning, right? Two particles hitting each other is already an extraordinary synchronization. They both had to be there. They both had to be lined up just right. And even though Einstein might tell us that there's no actual simultaneity, if you look at clocks from a relativistic perspective, that's its own thing. There's something about being in resonance enough to actually exchange information, right? And I'm not falling through the floor right now. The particles in me and the particles in the floor are meaningfully synchronized in a way that gives me a sense of reality that I can act on. And that's at a very basic level. And you start adding layers to that phenomenon, you get up to, I think, an everyday experience in which what we normally call meaning and communication is already an extraordinary, elaborate act of synchronicity. We're just used to tuning that out and not paying attention to it. And if we orient our attention toward it, and especially if we're also doing practices that create greater synchronization within ourselves, then we can start to notice not only the elements of synchronicity that are already existing in the current world and we're not tracking, but we get to see a bit of their momentum because it's come up through all these layers that comprise our reality. And we catch the ones that are in the layer we're at, and they can lead us to the next layers, which are ones that we would experience as a more overtly magical kind of a layer, where it seems like just about anything is possible, and that there are extraordinarily useful and extraordinarily emotionally and aesthetically rich communications coming to you directly from other parts of the system.
There's something
Yeah.
else I wanted to be curious about in terms of this historic trend as well, and like Jung talks about him walking with Philemon in his gardens, and there's this real sense of like diamonds, and there's again a history of inner voices that are wiser than we can possibly know. And that, to me, I kind of interpret that as that there's an inherent quality to the psyche that has that wisdom there. Like it's almost like I don't love this term, but the kind of Akashic records are like everyone has access to all prior knowledge of sorts. But if that's true, then it's not as much a development as like, well, I mean, maybe there's a development of better tuning in to that place, but it's sort of always there at the same time. And perhaps the blockages or the changes in throughout history, especially I can imagine with like dogmatic religious dark ages and whatnot, that kind of pull people away from tuning in to those voices and that. And I'm curious to hear about how you feel about the place of that kind of voice, that inner guide, in the development of kind of like a new culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this question of do you have to create it or was it always already there is a really interesting one, right? And a lot of the traditions have given us it was always already there, and you just either get out of the way or stop moving and it's present or something like that. And there's a lot of utility to that, but it also keeps us a little bit backwards looking. I think at the very least, you want to counterbalance that with a story that says there's a way that this might be new, that we might be creating and building this up. and then to be able to pull back from that and go, there's a way in which both of those have the exact same shape, and we could say either thing about it, and we should remember that we can say either thing about it. I'm very attracted and have worked a lot with systems in which it's mostly recovery and conductivity. And the Gurdjieff tradition presents a really great counterpoint. And I think if I didn't also have this notion of maybe I'm building it, maybe I'm cultivating it, maybe I'm creating it, that I think my approach to the other systems would have been a little bit imbalanced. The quality of the voice that guides us is extremely variable, right? You could say, well, we want a culture in which everybody is, in addition to being rational and functional and competent, informed by some kind of voice that comes out of a deeper layer of reality and a deeper layer of themselves. Great. Are they any good at hearing that voice? Do they have to suppress something or activate something? Do they have to let something go or try to accomplish something in order to do that? Is there really any difference between those? At some level, no, because the most effective forms of non-doing involve a contextualized intentionality, right? Unlike what I'm normally doing, now I'm going to not do, or I'm going to allow, or I'm going to listen, right? And I think from a Gurdjieffian point of view, we might say that it's the intentionality of that receptivity that's the active component. And then they would contextualize that in a set of practices that all involve the development of that intentionality. You could also talk about health, which is a big point, right? Gurdjieff isn't as focused on that, right? You might need to build up the capacity to be a receiver or a bridge between two realms that already exist. But there's also this notion of pollution. You know, you hear a lot of people go, well, I just trust my gut. And you're like, yeah, I've seen what you put in your gut. I know your gut I would not trust. Right. So like, how do we detoxify and open and strengthen and tone the part of ourself that has access to instinct and intuition? And how do we build up increased capacity to hear it with greater fidelity and to have that information distributed into the totality of ourselves? And I think the goal in something like the fourth way is to have created enough human general intelligence, I say sometimes, like that's what we need in tandem with artificial general intelligence. You have enough generalized self that everything you do is now working in tandem with or synchronized with the messages that would be coming from that intuitive voice, whether that intuitive voice is a whisper or an imaginally concretized entity like Philemon or anyone else we might encounter on another plane. But the goal would be to ultimately just be spontaneously moving from that rather than trying to listen and decode and act on it. But that's an aspirational goal for most people for down the way.
Yeah, there's a real sense of like this embodied epistemological skill combined with a kind of, yeah, it reminds me of the model of like there's a unconsciously incompetent and then consciously incompetent and then consciously competent and then unconsciously competent as kind of like the flow state of, you know, mastery of talent and skill that can then be let go of, and there's a trust in the surrender that's there to capture and translate what's coming in.
My general take. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
All right. I generally think of myself as having a subconscious intelligence that has the possibility to exceed my conscious intelligence, but only if I help it grow, right? If I don't help it grow, then it remains the subconscious intuitive intelligence of a child. So I have to assist it. How do I assist it? Well, I feed it things and then I practice acting on its behalf. And why feeding it things is what the Gurdjieffians might call the food of impressions. Right? You like detect meaningful significance in the world and you connect it in a certain way so that it goes more deeply into yourself, goes to another part of yourself you don't see, tells that part what this world is like, And then you also practice acting on those impulses, on whims and little things like that, with a general reasonableness and ethics and all that kind of stuff we use to secure that. But you have to make yourself act on those things, right? It's not as simple as Philemon told me and then I did it. I have to exert intentional discipline to cause myself to carry out my subtle prompts. And so as I get better at feeding inputs into the subconscious and making myself enact them in the world, it's like I'm cultivating a maturation of the subconscious intelligence, hopefully to the point where it exceeds my conscious intelligence. But I don't want to just trust it if it's not in excess of my conscious intelligence. I want to kind of keep it down a little bit until it has that level of capacity.
There's also qualitative experiences where even if there's a competence level increase or an ease or an efficiency, you might want to retain the experience. The framing of the 4 different levels of competency reminds me actually of a little bit of what Colin Wilson talks about, in that, he talks a little bit about the usefulness of the robot in that unconscious competence kind of way, where he kind of says, well, when I'm learning to type on the keyboard, it's very difficult and it takes a lot of effort for me to memorize all the keystrokes, blah, blah, blah. But once you reach a level of unconscious competence, right, which in the framework, the quadrant or the 4 levels, right, that's the highest one. It's almost like actually what opens up, if you are able to re-engage, your attention, is a kind of meta competence or a meta-conscious competence where you can delegate the parts of it that don't matter, say, that aren't important to you, to the robot because of the unconscious competence, but you can take command and ownership of the aspects of the experience that are delightful, and one of the ways that he makes this comparison plain is he sort of says, well, you can imagine, a piece of poetry or a piece of music. The first time you read it or listen to it, you really listen because it's the first time. But even on the second time, it says started to become automatic. You kind of know what to expect and you don't really listen. And the more you listen, the less you listen in a way, Yeah.
Yeah, there's I really recommend Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, as like a state-of-the-art cognitive science take on the robot and the self, so to speak.
Yeah, I've read
There's
that one.
parts
It's a
of
great
ourselves
book.
that require effort and parts that can be automated. And there's processes of where I would have to do work in order to automate a particular skill and gain unconscious mastery in it. There's situations where I probably should use one and probably should use the other. There are ways in which I should switch between and hybridize them. So for all of that, I need some third thing. I need a metacognitive interbeing of some kind and that seems to be the skill that's generally missing from conventional education, and that a metamodern cultural growth would want to prioritize in a way that's informed by someone like Gurdjieff, who did a lot of work on these very things.
Definitely. Yeah. Welcome back. I thought maybe we could jump back in by talking a little bit about the hyperpersonal essays thing again, because in one of your videos you kind of you gave an explanation of this as like there's a level of acknowledgement of the aspect of your personal interpretation that's like kind of embedded in the translation of his ideas you're offering, and that's I guess what you would contextualize that as calling them personal essays. But you're saying that calling them hyper personal essays is like a kind of a leaning in to them, and I guess I'm kind of curious how you would elaborate that, because I'm very interested in this idea of the way that ideas transform as they're passed from thinker to thinker and from generation to generation. And actually, that's more specifically what Mystic was trying to do. It wasn't so much concerned just with the idea of a general picture of there being such an ancient proto lineage or whatever. He more specifically wanted to know what were the original ideas. That's specifically what he wanted to know. And he was trying to trace the transformations of those ideas kind of backwards throughout history. And I guess what in connection with this notion of translation, because obviously we talked already about how many of Gurdjieff's students have different takeaways, say, about what maybe the work is about, or their own lens that they're bringing to Gurdjieff, or what they found that worked for them. And yeah, I guess, could you maybe share your thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, there's a way of thinking about hyperpersonal where I'm leaning into something that's always true of everyone, right? I don't want to pretend I'm giving just a clean description of the facts, and I'm a little suspicious of people that do that. On the other hand, it does also identify this book as something that's going to be stylistically infused with my own approach, and not an attempt to say what I think they say in this lineage, or say what I think they would say if they wanted to write a scholarly tome about Gurdjieff, right? So it also defines a certain genre of engagement that gives you the freedom to not only be as personal as you want to be, but try to find something deep in the personalness of it itself, which is an educational or transmissive quality. And to me, that's one of the most amazing things about his writing style, which is very strange. And he talks in his writings about his various theories of communication, right? This is not straightforward writing. You can't just, it's not like reading Thich Nhat Hanh or something. You're like, oh, that's a really nice principle, I'm going to apply that, right? It's oriented to bypass the normal way in which we take in information. And it does that in a number of different modes. And one of those modes is just trying to get his character across, because the transformation has occurred in his being.
Yeah.
And if he can't share his being through his peculiar character, then the flavor of the transmission won't come. And so in the first book, in Beelzebub's Tales, it's mostly in the introduction and in the epilogue. And then you get this story. In the next book, he's trying to do it in the form of an autobiography. And in the third book, which people debate whether it was completed or not, but to me, Life is Real Only Then When I Am is nothing but character, right? It's just, he's learned how to even distort the normal structure of sentences in a way that makes him feel as if the richness of his peculiarity and all of its subconscious understanding is coming across. And that's something that really stands out to me and affects me and informs my take on the teaching. So I want to honor that hyperpersonal quality in his work and attempt to approximate it in my own, but also attempt to make it apparent as an option that everyone has.
Yeah. No,
that touches on like one aspect of your question, but
sure,
where else would you like to go?
Well, it strikes me that description is remarkably similar to how a true believer might relate to scripture. That's, first of all, that part of the quality that is definitive of scripture in a way is being characteristic of the prophet, right? The guided man, so to speak. And I'm curious how you would compare and contrast that way of framing it with Gurdjieff. Is Gurdjieff a modern prophet of sorts, or how would you relate to that way of talking about it?
Yeah, I usually don't bother too much about that layer. To me, it's much more straightforward. So I'm in Canada, and one of the great Canadian singers was Leonard Cohen. And Leonard Cohen spent a lot of the last part of his life studying at a Zen monastery. And I remember seeing on television, an interviewer said, "What was it that attracted you to Zen Buddhism?" And he said, "Nothing. I met a guy who impressed me. And if that guy had been a Muslim, I'd be a Muslim right now." So that kind of thing, where to me, it's here's another human being. And he's very strange and he's very compelling. And he has more of something that I want as well.
Yes.
And so I rate to it like that. Now, you could get to speculations about what's the role of saints and avatars and the historical unfolding of the world and all these sort of interesting things. And it's fun to play in that area, but it's not necessary for me in terms of relating to like, here's a guy.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you've described the organic way in which we recognize someone from whom we want to learn, someone who we want to be our teacher. You've described that very well. but that seems to me somewhat different qualitatively from someone who markets or describes themselves as a spiritual teacher. And so I guess because I'm thinking that you would agree with that description of him, that he was a spiritual teacher. So then I'm like, well, how much of a gap is there between spiritual teacher and what you might call a prophet, especially given that specifically what I'm thinking of is there's this quality in what we might call prophets. And I was actually chatting to Alexander a little bit about this last night, about the strange difference between this phenomenon and how it's portrayed in religious contexts. So in a religious context, you get this, spiritual leader, this guided man who walks his path, but who also is able to communicate some of that, but not in a way where it's just like only for people like him, right? It's almost like he communicates it in a way where it's like a hall of mirrors where each person sees in the teaching something about themselves and what their own path is. And in religious context, see, for me, that's almost like the mark of someone who's really guided is that spiraling outward of these different ways of interpreting the insights, and this practical application, this many different people finding ways of making use of the principles and living well. And in a religious context, it's essentially demonized. It's seen as, well, my spiraling line is the true line, and yours are all. Whereas obviously in Gurdjieff, and this is something I find quite charming, is you're like, well, yeah, there's these spiraling lines, and that's part of the beauty of it, which I agree with. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, because it seems like there's a real parallel there in terms of the phenomenology surrounding the teaching and the spiraling off. But because there's no institutional orthodoxy, you're not getting this kind of, there's no church of Gurdjieff. So you don't get people saying, oh, well, or maybe you do. I don't know. I'm not as involved, but maybe there is some kind of orthodoxy, but certainly it's not prominent enough that I've encountered it. So yeah, I guess I'm kind of just wondering, like, how do you distinguish between a spiritual teacher and a prophet, and what do you make of that way of thinking about it?
There are groups and lineages that are a little bit more orthodox and dogmatic, and some that are less so, and some that probably wouldn't fit into either of those categories. Gurdjieff wrote and thought a lot about this very problem. If you read through Beelzebub's Tales, one of the major things is the way in which every one of the previous prophets failed because something went wrong in the first generation of their students. And so part of his work is an attempt to bypass that problem by, in some ways, diversifying the teaching, and in some ways burying it, in some ways making sure what he's trying to say doesn't go very simply into the part of your brain that normally thinks it knows what's happening. There's a sense in which, and it's tricky, especially tricky when you're dealing with complexity, because complexity brings with it ambiguity, and people don't necessarily understand something that's more complex than what they're used to working with. And that means they can't necessarily tell, except by their feelings, whether they're dealing with someone who's tricking him through ambiguity or who's offering actual complexity. And human beings go in both of those directions, right? If you wanted to create an institutional structure that took advantage of the greatest number of people, maybe for good, maybe for ill, you would want them each to be able to read into your teachings whatever they wanted, right? You'd want to have a holy book where anybody could pick it up, find something in it that they liked, and even if the next guy reads the exact opposite statement at a different point in that holy book, everybody feels like they know what it is. And that would be a worldly power move of some kind. But a very similar thing happens if someone with organic complexity is trying to communicate, especially if they're trying to communicate being to being or subconscious to subconscious, because that has to bypass the front of your mind in some ways, right? It's not a teaching style where person A articulates it exactly, you receive it, remember it, then act on it, and now you have the same condition. It doesn't work that way. They say a bunch of things, and they know something. And then while you're hearing them say a bunch of things, maybe you have a feeling, or maybe later you have an idea, and it's translated indirectly.
Or maybe you cling on to some small subset of the things that they've said, because those things really make sense to you.
That's right. And maybe you're specializing in part of their teaching. Maybe you're a tentacle of it that goes out in one direction. You don't have to worry about the other ones. Or maybe you're here to just take part of it and combine it with other things that you're working on. There's lots of good ways for this to work indirectly. Gurdjieff as a person was kind of fierce about trying to make sure people didn't put him into the box of prophet, right? He had a very, in some ways, charmingly grandiose notion of the work that he was involved in. And the other people there agreed that it was radical, that it was different, that it was kind of world historical as far as they could tell, that it wasn't just a guy with an interesting theory of psychology. It was another order of being that had something to say about the whole time period we live in and the human condition. But when he's not there to push people away in order to and make difficult conditions so they don't become believers, then how does it shake out? Some people will become believers, some people won't. There'll be a whole mess.
Yeah.
My sense is there's a possibility for a Gurdjieffian renaissance that would involve the reintegration of a lot of different people who've approached this in very different ways, and also integrating new philosophy, new culture, new tech, new science, all that kind of stuff. But there's, one of the things that stands out to me, just from my whole personal life, has been that I expect someone who's discovered something to be a little different, to be an interesting human being, right? If you look at, I saw a great documentary about a rogue offshoot of the Mormons, all right, and they believe the original teaching and believe that the main Church of Latter-day Saints isn't doing it properly. And they have this guy, right? And he's the illuminated spiritual savior of their community. And you look at him and it's just some little old man in a suit. There's no glint in his eye. There's no peculiarity to his teaching. There's nothing there. And you think, well, I would expect a spiritual person to be strange somehow, to surprise me in some ways, not just to look like a regular guy with a name tag that says he's an illuminated adept.
Steve.
Yeah, Steve. Master Steve.
Yeah.
So I think there's and we're not all organically healthy enough for this, possibly, but I think there is an organic and intuitive way of thinking about what these changes would look like in someone else. And that if we tune into that part of ourselves, we can get better at the skill of that kind of recognition. There's an American teacher named Adi Da, was very controversial, but I studied his work for a long time. He said, if God is real, you should see it on the faces of the old people. Meaning if they've been tuned into this their whole lives, then they should look a little different. They should have a little bit of radiance to them or something like that. Not just look like a regular old person.
Some of them do have a little bit of radiance to them,
Yeah,
to be honest.
yeah.
I'm just reflecting a little bit on some of the moments in my life where I've met an extraordinary human and also found disappointment with kind of leaning in and that might be some of my own proclivities of resistance to going too far into claiming any one particular teaching as my own, and kind of putting that's a chameleon issue with chameleon nature. But there's definitely something about the attraction to some kind of quality. But that I feel like that happens all the time, even in regular relationships, right? There's someone who's, I don't know, on stage and they're playing guitar and singing, and I'm like, wow, this person has some kind of energy to them that's really attractive. And the new prophet is kind of like the social media influencer, and we've got this sense of this person's, they're daring to be on the phone and speaking to me, and there's a risk, I think, of that being captured. I don't know if it feels like a bit of a tangent to what I want to talk about, but there's definitely a sense of the psyche's natural tendency to lean towards something that feels different. And perhaps the more kind of shadow work and exploration you do, the more novelty you need in some sense to feel that draw.
I think it's also important to mark out, I think, a difference in that part of what it's not just so there's an ineffability about the quality that we're trying to name. I think that's one of the reasons it goes unnamed. But it's not just any old charisma. That's certainly, which is, I think, what maybe is analogizable to a social media influencer, right? It's not just being interesting or whatever, or being attractive in a pop star sense. There's something about it where they seem changed by the ideas that they speak about. So it's not just like they're interesting, but it's like the interesting quality seems to have something to do with their way of relating to the world and their willingness to embody that way of relating.
Right. They're transmitting something bigger than what I'm used to.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's variations within that, because I mean, I've been with some people who I would consider to be saints in terms of their degree of transmission. And then when they talk about the world and human beings, they sound ridiculous. They sound paranoid or dogmatic, or they're just a mouthpiece of a tradition, right? So there's different aspects of a person. And I'm hoping that as we move the new culture forward in a way that's spiritually authentic, we can get more of these figures and have a more distributed, intersubjective, intelligent way of holding them and not succumbing to the dangers, but also get them as more intelligent, more complex versions of how they could potentially present themselves. You know, I think a lot about just the difference between healthy food and unhealthy food, or right? Food that you have to chew up is usually more nourishing than a potato chip that just melts into your body. It's junk food because it goes in so easy and becomes addictive. So we find these different kinds of charismas. And the one where you have to put in more work because there's more complexity and you have to assimilate more down over time, that usually tends to be the better one, the healthier one.
Yeah, definitely. I think I really like the way you localized part of the danger in the ambiguity of there's an ambiguity involved in, I think, like you were saying, in a genuine wisdom, that because what you're trying to express is so challenging to the usual way of relating to the world, that there's no way of closing it down without totally ruining it, you know what I mean? And I really like that, and I thought maybe I guess to open up the thing before I was saying about the spiraling, the separation, the divergence of the teachings, and a quote that you used in one of your videos, which was that Gurdjieff made a comment that in each of his students he could see stamped on their forehead, right, candidate for the madhouse. What do you think he was talking about there? And like, I guess, what do you think we can do to try to counteract that tendency to distort? Say if we happen to know a great spiritual teacher, how can we combat this problem, this tendency that seems almost inherent in human nature to distort the message that we receive so that, I don't know, it suits us? Well, how would you even relate to the motivation for the distortion there?
Yeah, a lot of parts to that. So the candidate for the madhouse is part of an anecdote that's featured in Gurdjieff's final book, Life is Real Only Then When I Am. And it's given as an example of a new kind of allegory that he's going to tell. So he's like, here's an example of how I'm going to be writing this book. And then he tells this story of going over to visit the Americans and listening to them and telling them that their vibrations are like canned food and seeing this thing on their forehead. So there's a sense in which it's a coded message and you have to dig through it. You'd have to read it many times and let it influence your own subconscious. But my sense of, at a more superficial level than that, what he's pointing to is a neurotic tendency in some of his students and in a lot of people who are particularly contemporary Western spiritual seekers, who view this all in a very idealistic and psychological way, right? People who are not becoming fuller, richer, more competent, more interesting human beings, but who are becoming more and more worried about watching themselves and analyzing what they're doing and making sure they're remembering the teachings. And there's a sense in which the self-remembering processes in the Gurdjieffian work can be taken in many different senses. And if you're constantly trying to remember to watch yourself, right, then you become unavailable to your loved ones, unavailable to play, unavailable to certain elements of the richness of the being. And I think that's one of the things he's criticizing, is they're shutting aspects of themselves down, and he's been telling them to open aspects up.
So like missing the forest for the trees kind of thing.
Sure, yeah. Then there's a question, I think in your prompt there, about, how do we relate to somebody in order to have a more successful and less diluting and possibly less traumatic kind of interaction with them. First of all, we have to remember that they are multiple, right? That if we have the ability to recognize something in them that we want, that feels like it might be transmissional to us, there's still a human being there. And those are not contradictory, right? We just have to have them, don't let them get in each other's way. There's a person there, accept that, that's fine. That person might not even know what it is about them that's so amazing. And the things they think they did to get there might not be the things that they did that actually got them there. Those are two slightly different things. And we need to be able to contextualize and hold those apart while being a full participant. I think we have to, this seems to me really important, constantly remember what it is that we're there for, right? I've been in situations with sort of long-term teachers who were really extraordinary at their teaching and extraordinary in their energetic transmission capacity. And then they would say something about politics or women or food or the war or whatever it is. And afterwards, the students would gather and, oh, can you believe he said that? Blah, blah, right? And I'm like, what do you care? Are you here to hear his opinions about social issues? Or are you here to soak up as much of his transmission as possible? If the latter is the case, then don't forget that that's what you're here for. What do you care what he says about things? And if it's upsetting to you, so what, right? But that's a subset of the strategy of constantly remember that you're there to do something for yourself. You're not there to just be a participant in someone else's game.
That's very healthy.
Yeah.
But I also feel like what you've described there, that situation, it's almost brings me back to the thing about it being maybe inherent in human nature, because I feel like there's an inevitability to, if you become, and maybe this is why Gurdjieff tried to discourage the kind of worship or the idolatry, or however you might want to talk about it. But there's a sense in which the more you become fascinated and impressed by someone, the more certain you are that there's got to be something wrong with them because they're just a human. So you jump and latch onto the very first thing that humanizes them, not necessarily because it's important, because that's why you're there, but because it helps you feel a little better about yourself. It's like, oh, he's not perfect. Thank fucking God, he's not perfect, you know?
Yeah, and there's a useful and a non-useful way to go through that process, right? Right? You hear your teacher fart and you go, oh, thank God, it's a human being. And as a human being, I, as a human being as well, maybe can have a deeper relationship with this organism that has something I really value. Or you could say, well, that's a reason why I don't really have to be a full participant in this process.
Bubble popped, dream ruined, off I
go. So we should, at the very least, hopefully, create a culture in which we're not shocked by the presence of either the human element of the spiritual teacher or the presence of spiritual teachers of various degrees and styles among the rest of the humans. Right? All that should seem kind of normal to us.
No, I totally agree. And actually, it kind of reminds me of, I have a number of religious friends, and we dialogue about these matters sometimes. And one of the things I constantly stress is this notion of trying to separate the man and the message, and saying, okay, look, I'm just like way more ready than you are to say maybe this bit is just the man, the flawed human being coming through. Like, it's scripture, so there's a tendency to view it as none of it is sort of representative of human foibles. But I actually prefer to take the other view. Most of it is representative of human foibles, and there are little bits and pieces of insight and wisdom scattered through and encoded in these stories. They've been collected and preserved for a reason, but certainly you should not get the idea in your head that Jesus or Muhammad or anything or anyone like that was perfect, because I mean, first of all, you're going to torture yourself trying to live up to an ideal that's not possible. But second of all, you're relating to a delusion. Like, that's not a realistic way to try to live. And you'll probably become disillusioned eventually if you don't make peace with a more human understanding.
There are two basic transmission strategies as I read it, right? One is to say, some parts of Tibet have a strategy like this, where the more you see your teacher as a perfect Buddha, the more you can relate to a perfect Buddha and activate that part in yourself. So you have the opportunity to view this person as perfect and to be in some kind of relationship to something which is actually transcendental and transhuman. So there's a viability to that, and that's expressed by teachers who also take on some of the pageantry, right? There's tremendous histories of teachers who are going to sit on a pedestal, and there's going to be radiance and gold things around them. And you go, well, maybe that's what it takes for my cells to recognize the image of the human divinity, right? That's what activates it for me, is recognizing it, and they are performing the role so that I can activate that part of myself, and it won't activate unless I see something and go, that's damn near perfect. So that's one strategy. The other strategy is, first of all, that's dangerous and will create oscillations in our relationship, but that our ability to pass on something authentic from person to person is nested in our human complexity. Right. So there are teachers who do the exact opposite of that, and they're trying to constantly show themselves as the mortal, finite, limited person they are, maybe even to an extreme that isn't useful to their students sometimes, because they're trying to make themselves as transparent as possible to the spiritual thing that they've achieved or attuned themselves to. And they don't want any sense of social stress or status or performance getting in the way of that, right? So both strategies have their advantages and their disadvantages. And in order to be sane, we should probably know that both are in play and find our own way of steering between them.
Yeah. I mean, a more sanitized version of the perfection strategy strikes me as the notion or maxim that never to doubt God's wisdom, or always to trust that whatever's happening is happening for a reason, or there's a sense in which I think it is very productive to try to instrumentalize even the worst things that happen to you and to say, if there's a lesson in this, what is the lesson? And one way of expressing that is, well, if I relate to you as perfect, then I can only look at me as to find the flaw, to find what's not right, to find what's insufficient, and there's something helpful about that. But in general, I think I would prefer to localize that notion in the cosmos or the universe itself rather than in a human being, just because of the propensity of a human being not only to inject his own flaws into his message, but also not to know the difference between those two things, to not be capable of distinguishing them himself.
Yeah, and it may be different for different kinds of people, because we might have, like what we were mentioning, maybe the shamanic kind of character, and people who are more like that may be more able to play in realms of uncertainty and ambiguity and complexity around this stuff. And there may be people who need their spirituality to just be given to them like it's a fact that they can mobilize on. And there's also this notion of developmental complexity, that the more sophisticated your social and cognitive apparatus is, the more space you have to hold things that are contradictory. And if you don't have that, then you need it to be very simple, and you don't want anyone to mess with it because you've got to hold on to it carefully. But the sense of a metamodern or liminal or integrative or whatever kind of culture is one in which we can do that move I called sincere irony, right? Where the awareness of the foibles, the awareness of the complexity, the awareness of the fact that maybe we don't have to believe in it. Maybe we don't have to believe in anything in order to be a participant in this. None of that necessarily gets in the way of being a real, active, dynamic, engaged being, right? You can be, I mean, this is one of the strange things to most people who are embedded in traditional mythic Christianity, is you can have transformative, life-transforming, heart-breaking visions and experiences of Jesus and not believe he was a real historical figure at all, right? Those two things actually don't get in each other's way, because one thing is about the cognitive sophistication with which you hold information about the world, which is inherently uncertain and complicated, and people are inherently uncertain and complicated. And the other one is your ability to go into modes of transcendental and devotional, self-surrender, non-duality, all those sorts of things. And there's no reason those should impede on each other. So I think we have the opportunity to build up a new kind of spiritual culture that isn't based on holding desperately on to the idea that there's a perfect source of wisdom, and that to question that wisdom or to experience uncertainty would cost us access to the most valuable things. I think there's a culture in which complexity and uncertainty are a route to re-secure the most valuable things.
I really love that, and I like in general your continual emphasis on this theme of a return. You know, a convergence. Yeah, that all divergences eventually converge again. I think that's very true, and something that, you know, is certainly resonant in my experience, and I really like that conceptual emphasis in some of these ideas. So yeah.
Yeah, there was a mention of like, it wasn't phrased this way, but there's something about animism that's very similar to Part's work, right? And to this kind of Gurdjieffian sense that's backed up by a lot of the new neuropsychological and cognitive studies, that we're actually much more of a plurality than a singularity. And that the work we have to do is not to reveal our God-given one singular self, but to try to create more of a collaborative intelligence and change our being through that. Well, that's in the ancient systems if we interpret them right, right? That's what a pantheon is, right? We can use terms for what Gurdjieff is talking about. He would say centers or brains. We could say different neurointelligence systems or something like that. Sounds very contemporary. We could just as easily say the different animal spirits that are in us, or any number of old-fashioned phrasings, because wherever human beings were rich and complex and safe and challenged enough to mature and flourish and had inputs from the more organically esoteric people in their networks, they probably achieved the same kinds of richness and depth of insights that we have, but they called it differently. So there is an element of return to all of this. And even a lot of our, we don't want to put real novelty off the table, right? There are things happening now that maybe never happened on this planet before, but so much of the most important stuff is being rediscovered.
Yeah, I think actually this is one of the things that humanity, that modern men have forgotten and don't know that they've forgotten, is that our relationship with time for millennia was this cyclical, rhythmic, returning thing, that it was a repeating cycle that you learned from through successive cycles. And nowadays we have watches, we have clocks, and we very much have a sense of linearity, like time is like this march. That's how the modern concept is, the march of time, which is a single file march. It's a linear thing, which is very different from the ancestral notion of time and the ancestral relationship with time that's built up in many different myths. That today, it's one of the reasons I think that today we find myths so like unpalatable or difficult to fit together with our modern sensibilities, is that we've forgotten many of the concepts that they were rooted in, like, for instance, this cyclical nature of time. Once you remember that time had a cyclical quality for many, many years, a lot of the practices that we have that seem quite esoteric or arcane suddenly make a little bit more sense. And you can do a number of adjustments like that in your perception, where you kind of rediscover a perceptual prejudice or cognitive prejudice that was inherent in a prior age that we've kind of quote unquote outgrown, but we've outgrown it so thoroughly that we've genuinely forgotten what it was like to look at the world that way. And now we look back at these historical artifacts and say, whatever could this mean? And it's because we don't make a genuine effort to project ourselves into that. And partly that's because it's so difficult, but also I think it's something that anyone who wants to make a serious study of history really has to do, is to try to remember that these men did not think like we do. And, you know, you have to try and remember all the ways in which their paradigmatic interface with reality was dramatically different to how we now perceive things and how we've been the received perception of modernity.
Yeah, there's a real overly simplified tendency to imagine ancient people as just contemporary people in a different circumstance. But we've lost a lot of the experiences that might be necessary in order to sympathize with the difference between them and us, right? Even most of us, there's huge ranges of human experience and ecological experience that most people don't get today, right? So it'd be very hard for them to even figure out what those people were feeling about or thinking about. And at the same time, there seems to be some shift in the way that time is collectively perceived over the ages. I don't know if you guys know Adriana Forte. She's an Australian, but she's very focused on the return of the feminine and the cyclic. I jokingly call her a menstrual futurist, right? Her sense is that modernist linearity has sacrificed, in moving away from traditional and mythic worldviews, they also left behind some elements of understanding and structure that are more explicit in the feminine body in the way that it makes cycles more overt. And unless we
Absolutely.
fold that in, we're not really going to be able to get to a new kind of wisdom civilization where there's different ways of thinking about how the line and the circle come together, but the spiral is the most common symbol
Yeah.
for that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm fascinated by the way that different epochs internalize time differently. So you get these really sort of basic supercharged calendars are among the first things that human beings build, and they clearly are organizing their map of reality around some kind of seasonal and stellar charting system that moves in vast cycles. It's gorgeous.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get these big religions with these great stories of like several 1,000-year arcs. There was a creation, and then things were going well, and there was a collapse and an apocalypse, and then after that, there might be another one of those. And these people usually have some basic scribe-type technologies, right? There's sort of a codified law book and set of sort of seasonal predictions for not just the years, but some great year.
Mm-hmm.
And then modernity says, yeah, no. There's actually a lot of stuff that can change and isn't covered by that already. And we start to do this rapid transition. But that linearity is so singular, so monological, people sometimes say, that it clearly leaves out the feminine, leaves out the ecological, leaves out all kinds of other possible linear trajectories. And then you get postmodern time. Right? You get all these kind of forms of physics where time is looping back, or everything's happening somehow in multiple universes simultaneously, or, right? It keeps the linearity, but now it's expanded the linearity into a plurality. And what's on the other side of that? What does a metamodern or an integrative or a coherent pluralist time look like? It probably has some version of linearity, plurality, and circularity built into the same kind of structure. Whether that's toroidal or whether that's spiral, we can come up with a number of different symbols for it. But we need to get to something that supersedes and incorporates all of those different historical models of time.
One of the things that Alexander and I discussed using as a logo for our channel actually is a combination of or an animation that illustrates the identity between a sine wave, a spiral, and a circle. For that exact kind of reason of bridging that gap. And I think something I'm really interested in connection with these different paradigms of time is what we were talking about before in terms of the transformation of ideas. Because I think that, and this is actually something I've written about before in an essay called "The Sacred Significance of Writing." But it seems like in historical times, say, that the cyclical theory of time, or the cyclical way of conceptualizing time, rather, seems to legitimize a practice which today I think has really been forgotten, not only fallen out of favor, but been forgotten, which is that myths, from my way of looking at it, were constantly improved, constantly updated, because the myth contains like insights into life. And if you think cyclically, then you've received this myth because every generation before you improved it and retold it. And so now you're improving it, or you're changing it, your conceptual transformations on the basis of the insights of your lived experience. That becomes very legitimate. Whereas if we think in a linear progression, it's almost like you're falsifying the ideas. That's one way of thinking about it. You're changing them. They're not what they were, you're changing the story. But actually, if you think cyclically, that changing is actually part of the fabric of the story. That's how it came to be, and that's how it accumulated those insights that made it worth retelling to begin with. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a fascinating question, which is how do you incorporate your new and updated experiences into the cyclic repetition? Right. So modernity, not just modernity, let's say history in general, right? We lived in a nomadic cyclic kind of a universe where in some ways everything was anticipated to return the same way, which had a wonderful ability to be wise about phases, but also could be brutal, right? Everything's going back into the earth anyway, so there's no reason not to murder people or whatever it is. And then under the progress of history, tremendous devastation, but also a sense in like, no, we can really fix some of these things. We can make changes. That's great. Now, where the hell was I going with that?
Some kind of fusion between the two, I'm thinking, because that was the initial comment you made prior.
Yeah. Well, there was some specific thing around. Oh, yeah. It was about the intentionality with which we make the changes. So history, epitomized by modernity, seems to be trying to cause the change on purpose. Whereas the cycles did have change and development, which was incorporated in an indirect fashion through the attempt to repeat. And this is an interesting thing when you come up to, say, Nietzsche, right? Because the notion of the thought experiment of the eternal recurrence is very prominent in some of his writings. And what does it mean? Do you have the capacity to will things to be the same? And that doesn't mean they are the same. That might, in fact, be the recipe for becoming the kind of person who can change them in the right way. So it may be that he talked about this formula for greatness, to not want things to be different than they are. And do you have enough strength of heart to want to live the exact same experiences with no change endlessly? That kind of creative strength is the creative strength that can, I think, change things going forward. So it's a little bit like saying, if I try to repeat the myth many times, I bet I probably change it in a certain way that's different than the way I would change it if I thought, oh, I'm going to change it by incorporating my new ideas into it. There's something beautiful about the implicit incorporation.
Yeah. No, I really love that. And that's actually kind of what I was speaking to, because I don't think that the retelling by individual, family members or whatever, I don't think that there's usually an intentional transformation. I actually think it's just like when I was younger, I didn't really know what this meant, and now I do. And here's what it means. It's like my interpretation of this thing that I'm going to explain to you as part of the thing I'm telling to you, is something that came from my life. And so now that gets included in. There's not a sense in which, from my point of view, I'm changing it. I'm just letting you know how I understand it. But what you'll take away is that this is what this means.
There's some kind of like archetypal quality to a lot of this stuff, right? Like I'm thinking of the movie The Matrix, where like when I first saw it, it was just a cool cyberpunk action flick. But then another time in my life, it was like, oh, this is about governments and being anti-authoritarian. And then another time I was like, oh, this is a spiritual message about Gnosticism, and it's about yeah, there's so many ways of putting ourselves into these systems, and yeah, like I said, it doesn't really change the archetypes. It just, we're putting ourselves into it in a new light. So I'm curious about that, even like the attempt at retelling an old system, if we're just expressing the same archetypes but in our own unique way, then there's definitely, like, that feels good as long as we capture the same capacity of fullness with those archetypes.
Yeah. Are we doing a complete retelling? Are we doing a real retelling?
Yeah.
And there's a sense in which I think about spiritual teaching as being like mushrooms and mycelial networks, right? Because one is you have this idea of an unbroken transmission of a certain teaching, but it gets broken many times, or especially if we think about 1 million years of human beings or something like that. Then it's more like, well, it's underground, and then the mushrooms pop up. And then they go away, and then they pop up again later. And but it's the same network. It's producing the same thing. That's a transmission lineage, but there might appear to be gaps in it, right? So like we come to the archetype again and again, and if we reinvent the archetype with the same kind of dynamism and authenticity with which it was reinvented before and before and before, then we become part of this lineage.
I love
which
that.
isn't the same as just repeating it and passing it on. It's living it again.
And I think actually that speaks quite meaningfully to this question, which is a kind of an epistemological or modern question about like the historical validity of the notion of, so Gurdjieff kind of represents himself as, continuing a tradition. And I don't know, the way that you were just talking kind of opens up for me a sense of being able to continue the tradition without needing a direct conduit, because there's a sense in which we're all part of that network. So when the fruiting body appears and starts to grow, as long as you give it the right nutrients, then the archetype gets realized in a vitalizing way each time.
Yeah. The only danger there is that we can use that idea to let ourselves off the hook sometimes, right? We go, well, we're all just doing it, and then come up, and I don't really need to be part of a direct teaching, and therefore I don't need the rigor of the teaching. I don't really need to find somebody who has more experience than I do. But so as long as we actually do make the efforts, find people, put ourselves in the position of that human beings are always in, when they start to mutate in this way, then we can do it, and it won't all live up to some standard that other people have, but I think it needs to flourish in really varied ways of all kinds of different degrees. So I would really encourage people to not spare themselves the rigor that comes with tradition, but undertake any kind of mutant experiment with this that's possible, because that's how organic systems flourish.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's brilliant.
The other thing that popped up for me, just as an aside, is the similar to the repetition thing, is the rereading thing. So Gurdjieff asks everyone to read the books 3 times in 3 ways before you even start talking about them. And there's a way in which to reread is the only real mechanism we have for gauging depth in terms of communication. Right. It's very easy. You read a book and then you go, oh, there's a new exciting scientific or philosophical or psychological volume I want to check out. You keep reading the new one. You can't gauge if your depth is changing. If you reread something complex and discover new things, then you realize that something in you has changed. And finding something, whether it's Gurdjieff or the Bible or Nietzsche, but hopefully something complex enough to reward rereading and to go back into it again and again, is a really effective, transformative way of not only catalyzing change in yourself, but gauging that you have changed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think rereading is a great way of revealing, when you reread, parts of the book that you had insight into before will be hidden this time, concealed from you, but different parts will be revealed. And actually, in that same article I mentioned about the time thing, where I kind of talk about this different relationship with stories, one of the things I point out is that historically, like well-read men like modernity is like, we have so many books, but historically what it was to be well read was to own like half a dozen to a dozen classics and to have read them dozens and dozens of times. And so there's a really big difference between that and the way modern people relate to books as well. You can see this same kind of thing where it's like this kind of I don't know, like pick up and leave it, put it down and leave it, like kind of like almost like it's out there. The story is something I can pick up and put down. It's something for entertainment. It's not a part of my life. It's not part of how I relate to my world. You know what I mean? It's just one of those other thousands of books that I could have or not have or buy and maybe not read. Or, you know, books are very much things now, possessions. Whereas historically it was like this is like a secret chest full of hidden gems that it's your job to figure out which ones are the gems and to cut them to size and to polish them up. And the way you do that is by turning it over and over again in your mind.
Yeah, and let me just note that probably 10 or 15 minutes more of this and I should go and have some dinner. But yeah, we don't really experience books as projects, as work, as something that we work with in order to transform ourselves the way the best imagined ancient people with books might have been.
Yeah.
And I think there's a sense in which that's an element of the hyper-personal as well, right? If you find a writer, find a book where there's just so much in there, and you could sense you're not getting all of it, but you also sense that it's your kind of guy. Right? There's something of you speaking to you there, and you go back to it and you work with it. Then you cultivate a wisdom in yourself that is of yourself. Right? It makes you into a future unique example of the distribution of wisdom.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And I would just say from my own experience that some of the books that have gone on to influence me the most were some of the ones that I understood the least when I first read them, and read them anyway, partly because it's like, this is so difficult to follow, but this is just so fascinating, you know, that I really want to understand. And then I come out of the end of my first reading, I'm like, and I try to explain it to someone else, and I'm like, wow, I don't understand, but I kind of do. And I'm also so impressed with the ideas that I'm definitely going to come back and read it again and again until I master them, because they're so, because they speak to me in exactly that way, where you're like, this is a part of me. This is part of my path. This is like a paver I have to lay if I want to go forward. You know what I mean?
There's a certain expectation of resilience in human beings that I think exists in the Gurdjieffian approach, certainly around things like intentional suffering and really experiencing remorse and stuff like that, but also around what it's like to encounter material that you don't fully understand yet, right? Because we've cultivated a kind of consumer culture, even in education, where these are the books for the grade 6 students, and these are the books for the grade 7 students, and you don't want to give them something that exceeds their current generic capacity level, even though ancient children were taught to read on Plato and the Bible, and they just read the parts they could understand, right? So there's one way of going at human development and education where it's tailored so that you never have to experience the feeling of being stupid or not understanding or not being able to get it. And that's encouraged in popular writing because that sells. It's encouraged in, to some degree, AI and social networks and newspapers and magazines and all that kind of stuff. But there's this other sense of it's good to read something and not fully get it. That means there's something there worth returning to. And if you go, fuck, this is frustrating and I'm not tracking all of it properly, that feels bad, but that bad feeling is itself a good feeling. Like we need to encourage that kind of leading edge culture. A developmental culture has a positive feeling about some negative feelings.
Yeah. No, I definitely relate to that. I don't know how exactly, but certainly I experience that frustration as a positive feeling, as like, this is something that's calling more of me forth than I have, but maybe, you know, but there's something good about that. There's something that feels positive and open about that challenge.
Yeah, I wrote an article on my Substack a couple of months ago called Ordealology, right? And it's about like, how do we start thinking in using modern concepts of suffering intelligently rather than unintelligently. And there's
Yeah.
a whole bunch of ways of thinking about this that really converge well with Gurdjieff, whether it's Carol Dweck's work on the growth mindset or Nassim Taleb's work on anti-fragility, or all the kind of things that have come out of sports medicine about when and how you need distress in order to heal and in order to be well.
Yeah.
Right? How do we fold this stuff in, especially if we're looking at an age where automated pseudo-cognitive machines are going to take a huge load off us, and we're not really going to have to do a lot of the ordinary difficult processing we used to do.
Yeah.
So now you either do it on purpose or it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So there'll be a divide. But I think we are gaining a lot of practical, philosophical, psychological, and physiological information about why certain kinds of distress are useful and how to make use of them better. And that's definitely in Gurdjieff work. I keep doing this. That's because my copy of my book's over there, by the way.
Understandable.
Yeah, it definitely feels like there's a huge challenge in like recapturing the attention of new generations who have kind of been brought up in this hyper consumerist, quick attention span, easy access,
Factory schooling.
Yeah, factory schooling, and quick fixes, right? Like the self-help books are kind of these quick. If it's not quick and does something right away, then
very small attention span as well. It's characteristic of modernity,
right.
Yeah.
And,
I was just going to say, first of all, yes, I mean, the intentional attention response to attention hacking as the new norm is relevant. But Gurdjieff tells this story. I think it's in more than one of his books. It's definitely in the concluding segment to Beelzebub's Tales. But it's about the human being symbolized by a kind of cart and horse. Right. And there's the owner and the passenger and the driver and the horse and the machine and the bits that connect them, the reins. But he says of this cart that it was built by ancient people in a really interesting way, where going over the bumps in the road cause its joints to do something which releases a lubricant that allows it to stay functional. And so traveling on uneven roads causes the machine to keep itself functional. But now that it runs on smooth roads, it doesn't release the self-lubricating fluid, and as a result, it becomes more fragile and starts to break down.
I love that. And actually, It reminds me of something that Colin Wilson brings up again and again in relation to. Obviously, he has an explanatory scheme he wants to apply to occult phenomena. He calls it Faculty X. But something that he brings up again and again is that some of these abilities, or however you might relate to them, are the kinds of things that would have had a tremendous utility in certain moments in the wild. And similar to the analogy about the bumpy carts, now taken out of the wild, those higher capacities have died away because we just don't use them, because we're so insulated from everything that could possibly force us to make a real effort that we just never do.
Yeah, and some of that's wonderful, right? Like, it's great to live in a system where we don't have to make all the same stupid efforts that our ancestors made, but that means that we can pick and choose the efforts and that we have to do it on purpose. But if we don't purposefully undertake those efforts, we do begin to degenerate and lose our access to greater human developmental possibilities. Yeah, that was a good ending statement.
Yeah. Like nothing more needs to be said.
It's been a fucking wonderful conversation.
Yeah.
I would love to do it again. I feel like there's so much more that we could go into, so many more threads. I did a whole page, and I think I've barely touched on 10% of the notes that I actually prepared.
Yeah, I didn't even look at my notes.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much more to go into, but
yeah, well, this has been a pleasure, and I'd be happy to do a couple more hours with you guys anytime.
Awesome, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Layman. Yeah, such a pleasure, such a gift to have your
thank
wisdom
you for
and
sharing
words.
your wisdom and your articulate descriptions, and it's just been a wonderful conversation. I feel enriched by having had this opportunity.
Yeah, I kind of feel like I fell silent a bit in the last kind of quarter of the conversation, just because there's a lot of sort of like, oh yeah, there's stuff I need to integrate from this.
Processing, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So thank you.
I hope it ends up being useful to you, and I think you guys are exactly the right kind of guys to be collaborators in building a culture that has intelligent contemporary understanding, has the new vibe, but also has deep awareness of spiritual and transformational processes.
That's definitely.
Yeah.
And I think, sorry.
I was going to say, I'd like to also bring some more weirdness to the table too.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Sure.
That character,
That's right.
you know, that uniqueness.
Right. Now we all kept our shirts on. Maybe that's holding us back.
Exactly,
Next time.
No, the eccentricity does come through a little bit though, so you know it's not completely not there, but certainly I think that there's something very powerful about this idea of a full spectrum teaching. That I really related to that in some of your videos, and certainly that's a really great description of what I found so compelling about my teacher, was that he was a man who wasn't trying to shut down parts of himself. He was trying to include all of it in this self-developmental, transformative enterprise. And I think anybody else who has that attitude is a kindred spirit to me. So I'm really glad that we got to have this conversation, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening. I'm assuming it's evening there.
Yeah, it's 8:45 over here.
Oh man, yeah, let you go for some dinner. Yeah, thanks for staying so long.